whispering world of Southern Cadence, find a place to get cozy and fall asleep while we whisper the story of The Blind Man's World by Edward Bellamy, 1898. The narrative to which this note is introductory was found among the papers of the late Professor S. Erasmus Larrabee, and as an acquaintance of the gentleman to whom they were bequeathed, I was requested to prepare it for publication. This turned out a very easy task, for the document proved of so extraordinary a character that, if published at all, it should obviously be without change. It appears that the professor did really, at one time in his life, have an attack of vertigo, or something of the sort, under circumstances similar to those described by him, and to that extent his narrative may be found on fact. How soon it shifts from that foundation, or whether it does at all, the reader must conclude for himself. It appears certain that the professor never related to anyone, while living, the stranger features of the experience here narrated, but this might have been merely from fear that his standing as a man of science would be thereby injured. The professor's narrative. At the time of the experience of which I am about to write, I was professor of astronomy and higher mathematics at Abercrombie College. Most astronomers have a specialty, and mine was the study of the planet Mars, our nearest neighbor, but one in the Sun's little family. When no important celestial phenomena in other quarters demanded attention, it was on the ruddy disk of Mars that my telescope was oftenest focused. I was never weary of tracing the outlines of its continents and seas, its capes and islands, its bays and straits, its lakes and mountains. With intense interest I watched from week to week of the martial winter of the advance of the polar ice cap toward the equator, and its corresponding retreat in the summer, testifying across the gulf of space as plainly as written words to the existence on that orb of a climate like our own. A specialty is always in danger of becoming an infatuation, and my interest in Mars at the time of which I write had grown to be more than strictly scientific. The impression of the nearness of this planet, heightened by the wonderful distinctness of its geography as seen through a powerful telescope, appeals strongly to the imagination of the astronomer. On fine evenings I used to spend hours, not so much critically observing as brooding over its radiant surface, till I could almost persuade myself that I saw the breakers dashing on the bold shore of Kepler Land, and heard the muffled thunder of avalanches descending the snow-clad mountains of Mitchell. No earthly landscape had the charm to hold my gaze of that far-off planet, whose oceans, to the unpracticed eye, seem but darker and its continents lighter, spots and bands. Astronomers have agreed in declaring that Mars is undoubtedly inhabitable by beings like ourselves, but, as may be supposed, I was not in a mood to be satisfied with considering it merely habitable. I allowed no sort of question that it was inhabited. What manner of beings these inhabitants might be I found a fascinating speculation. The variety of types appearing in mankind even on this small earth makes it most presumptuous to assume that the denizens of different planets may not be characterized by diversities far profounder. Wherein such diversities, coupled with a general resemblance to man, might consist, whether in mere physical differences or in different mental laws, the lack of certain of the great passional motors of men or the possessions of quite others, were weird themes of never-failing attractions for my mind. The El Dorado visions with which the virgin mystery of the New World inspired the early Spanish explorers were tame and prosaic compared with the speculations which it was perfectly legitimate to indulge when the problem was the conditions of life on another planet. It was the time of the year when Mars is most favorably situated for observation, and anxious not to lose an hour of the precious season, I had spent the greater part of several successive nights in the observatory. I believed that I had made some original observation as to the trend of the coast of Kepler Land between Lagrange Peninsula and Christie Bay, and it was to this spot that my observations were particularly directed. On the fourth night, other work detained me from the observing chair till after midnight. When I had adjusted the instrument and took my first look at Mars, I remember being unable to restrain a cry of admiration. The planet was fairly dazzling. It seemed nearer and larger than I had ever seen it before, and its peculiar ruddiness more striking. In 30 years of observations, I recall, in fact, no occasion when the absence of exhalations in our atmospheres coincided with such cloudlessness in that of Mars as on that night. I could plainly make out the white masses of vapor at the opposite edges of the lighted disk, which are the mists of its dawn and evening. The snowy mass of Mount Hall over against Kepler Land stood out with wonderful clearness, and I could unmistakably detect the blue tint of the ocean of Delarue, which washes its base, a feat of vision often, indeed, accomplished by stargazers, though I had never done it to my complete satisfaction before. I was impressed with the idea that if I ever made an original discovery in regard to Mars, it would be on that evening, and I believed that I should do it. I trembled with mingled exultation and anxiety, and was obliged to pause to recover my self-control. Finally, I placed my eye to the eyepiece and directed my gaze upon the portion of the planet in which I was especially interested. My attention soon became fixed and absorbed much beyond my wont when observing, and that in itself applied no ordinary degree of abstraction. To all mental intents and purposes, I was on Mars. Every faculty, every susceptibility of sense and intellect seemed gradually to pass into the eye and become concentrated in the act of gazing. Every atom of nerve and willpower combined in the strain to see a little, and yet a little, and yet a little, clearer, far deeper. The next thing I knew, I was on the bed that stood in a corner of the observing room, half raised on an elbow, and gazing intently at the door. It was broad daylight. Half a dozen men, including several of the professors and a doctor from the village, were around me. Some were trying to make me lie down, others were asking me what I wanted, while the doctor was urging me to drink some whiskey. Mechanically repelling their offices, I pointed to the door and ejaculated, "President Bixby, coming," giving the impression to the one idea which my dazed mind at that moment contained. And sure enough, even as I spoke, the door opened, and the venerable head of the college, somewhat blown with climbing the steep stairway, stood on the threshold. With a sensation of prodigious relief, I fell back on my pillow. It appeared that I had swooned while in the observing chair the night before, and had been found by the janitor in the morning, my head fallen forward on the telescope, as if still observing, but my body cold, rigid, pulseless, and apparently dead. In a couple of days I was all right again, and should soon have forgotten the episode but for a very interesting conjecture which had suggested itself in connection with it. This was nothing less than that, while I lay in that swoon, I was in a conscious state outside and independent of the body, and in that state received impressions and exercised perceptive powers. For this extraordinary theory I had no other evidence than the fact of my knowledge in the moment of awakening that President Bixby was coming up the stairs. But slight as this clue was, it seemed to me unmistakable in its significance. That knowledge was certainly in my mind on the instant of arousing from the swoon. It certainly could have not been there before I fell into the swoon. I must therefore have gained it in the meantime, that is to say, I must have been in a conscious, percipient state while my body was insensible. If such had been the case, I reasoned that it was altogether unlikely that the trivial impression was to President Bixby had been the only one which I had received in that state. It was far more probable that it had remained over in my mind on waking from the swoon, merely because it was the latest of a series of impressions received while outside the body. These impressions were of a kind most strange and startling, seeing that they were those of a disembodied soul exercising faculties more spiritual than those of the body. I could not doubt. The desire to know what they had been grew upon me, till it became a longing which left me no repose. It seemed intolerable that I should have secrets from myself, that my soul should withhold its experiences from my intellect. I would gladly have consented that the acquisitions of half my waking lifetime should be blotted out, if so be in exchange I might be shown the record of what I had seen and known during those hours of which my waking memory showed no trace. None the less for the conviction of its hopelessness, but rather all the more, as the perversity of our human nature will have it, the longing for this forbidden lore grew on me, till the hunger of Eve in the garden was mine. Constantly brooding over desire that I felt to be vain, tantalized by the possession of a clue which only mocked me, my physical condition became at length affected. My health was disturbed and my rest at night was broken. A habit of walking in my sleep, from which I had not suffered since childhood, recurred and caused me frequent inconvenience. Such had been in general my condition for some time, when I awoke one morning with the strangely weary sensation by which my body usually betrayed the secret of the impositions put upon it in sleep, of which otherwise I should often have suspected nothing. In going into the study connected with my chamber, I found a number of freshly written sheets on a desk. Astonished that anyone should have been in my rooms while I slept, I was astounded, on looking more closely, to observe that the handwriting was my own. How much more than astounded I was on reading the matter that had been set down, the reader may judge if he shall peruse it. For these written sheets apparently contained the longed for but despaired of record of those hours when I was absent from my body. They were the lost chapter of my life, or rather, not lost at all, for it had been no part of my waking life, but a stolen chapter, stolen from that sleep memory on whose mysterious tablets may well be inscribed tales as much more marvelous than this, as this is stranger than most stories. It will be remembered that my last recollection before waking in my bed, on the morning after the swoon, was of contemplating the coast of Kepler Land with an unusual concentration of attention. As well as I can judge, and that is no better than anyone else, it is the moment that my bodily powers succumbed, and I became unconscious that the narrative which I found on my desk begins. Even had I not come as straight and swift as the beam of light that made my path, a glance about would have told me to what part of the universe I had fared. No earthly landscape could have been more familiar. I stood on the high coast of Kepler Land where it trends southward. A brisk westerly wind was blowing and the waves of the ocean of Dilabu were thundering at my feet, while the broad blue waters of Christie Bay stretched away to the southwest. Against the northern horizon, rising out of the ocean like a summer thunderhead, for which I at first mistook it, towered the far distant, snowy summit of Mount Hall. Even had the configuration of land and sea been less familiar, I should none the less have known that I stood on the planet whose ruddy hue is at once the admiration and puzzle of astronomers. Its explanation I now recognized in the tint of the atmosphere, a coloring comparable to the haze of Indian summer, except that its hue was a faint rose instead of purple. Like the Indian summer haze, it was impalpable, and without impeding the view bathed all objects near and far in a glamour not to be described. As the gaze turned upward, however, the deep blue of space so far overcame the roseate tint that one might fancy he were still on earth. As I looked about me, I saw many men, women, and children. They were in no respect dissimilar, so far as I could see, to the men, women, and the children of the earth, save for something almost childlike in the untroubled serenity of their faces, unfurrowed as they were by any trace of care, of fear, or of anxiety. This extraordinary youthfulness of aspect made it difficult, indeed, save by careful scrutiny to distinguish the young from the middle-aged, maturity from advanced years. Time seemed to have no tooth on Mars. I was gazing about me, admiring this crimson-lighted world, and these people who appeared to hold happiness by a tenure so much firmer than men's, when I heard the words, "You are welcome," and, turning, saw that I had been accosted by a man with the stature and bearing of middle age, though his countenance, like the other faces which I had noted, wonderfully combined the strength of a man's with the serenity of a child's. I thanked him and said, "You do not seem surprised to see me, though I certainly am to find myself here." "Assuredly not," he answered. "I knew, of course, that I was to meet you today. And not only that, but I may say I'm already in a sense acquainted with you, through a mutual friend, Professor Budrys. He was here last month, and I met him at that time. We talked of you and your interest in our planet. I told him I expected you." "Budrys," I exclaimed. "It is strange that he has said nothing of this to me. I met him every day." But I was reminded that it was in a dream that Budrys, like myself, had visited Mars, and on awakening had recalled nothing of his experience, just as I should recall nothing of mine. When will man learn to interrogate the dream soul of the marvels it sees in his wanderings? Then he will no longer need to improve his telescopes to find out the secrets of the universe. "Do your people visit the Earth in the same manner?" I asked my companion. "Certainly," he replied, "but there we find no one able to recognize us and converse with us as I am conversing with you, although myself in the waking state. You, as yet, lack the knowledge we possess of the spiritual side of the human nature which we share with you. That knowledge must have enabled you to learn much more of the Earth than we know of you," I said. "Indeed it has," he replied, "from visitors such as you, of whom we entertain a concourse constantly. We have acquired familiarity with your civilization, your history, your manners, and even your literature and languages. Have you not noticed that I am talking with you in English, which is certainly not a tongue indigenous to this planet?" "Among so many wonders I scarcely observed that," I answered. "For ages," pursued my companion, "we have been waiting for you to improve your telescopes so as to approximate the power of ours, after which communication between the planets would be easily established. The progress which you make is, however, so slow that we expect to wait ages yet." "Indeed, I fear you will have to," I replied. "Our opticians already talk of having reached the limits of their art." "I do not imagine that I spoke in any spirit of petulance," my companion resumed. "The slowness of your progress is not so remarkable to us as that you make any at all, burdened as you are by a disability so crushing that if we were in your place, I fear we should sit down in utter despair." "To what disability do you refer?" I asked. "You seem to be men like us." "And so we are," was the reply, "save in one particular, but there the difference is tremendous. Endowed otherwise like us, you are destitute of the faculty of foresight, without which we should think our other faculties well nigh valueless." "Foresight," I repeated. "Certainly you cannot mean that it is given to you to know the future." "It is given not only to us," was the answer, "but so far as we know, to all other intelligent beings of the universe except yourselves. Our positive knowledge extends only to our system of moons and planets and some of the nearer foreign systems, and it is conceivable that the remoter parts of the universe may harbor other blind races like your own. But it certainly seems unlikely that so strange and lamentable a spectacle should be duplicated. One such illustration of the extraordinary deprivations under which a rational existence may still be possible ought to suffice for the universe." "But no one can know the future except by inspiration of God," I said. "All our faculties are by inspiration of God," was the reply, "but there is surely nothing in foresight to cause it to be so regarded more than any other. Think a moment of the physical analogy of the case. Your eyes are placed in the front of your heads. You would deem it an odd mistake if they were placed behind. That would appear to you an arrangement calculated to defeat their purpose. Does it not seem equally rational that the mental vision should range forward, as it does with us, illuminating the path one is to take, rather than backward, as with you, revealing only the course you have already trodden, and therefore have no more concern with? But it is no doubt a merciful provision of providence that renders you unable to realize the grotesqueness of your predicament, as it appears to us. But the future is eternal, I exclaimed. How can a finite mind grasp it? Our foreknowledge implies only human faculties, was the reply. It is limited to our individual careers on this planet. Each of us foresees the course in his own life, but not that of other lives, except so far as they're involved with his. That such a power as you describe could be combined with merely human faculties is more than our philosophers has ever dared to dream, I said. And yet, who shall say, after all, that it is not in mercy that God has denied it to us? If it is a happiness, as it must be, to foresee one's happiness, it must be most depressing to foresee one's sorrows, failures, yes, and even one's death. For if you foresee your lives to the end, you must anticipate the hour and manner of your death. Is it not so? Most assuredly, was the reply. Living would be a very precarious business, were we uninformed of its limit. Your ignorance of the time of your death impresses us as one of the saddest features of your condition. And by us, I answered, it is held to be one of the most merciful. Foreknowledge of your death would not indeed prevent your dying once, continued my companion, but it would deliver you from the 1,000 deaths you suffer through uncertainty whether you can safely count on the passing day. It is not the death you die, but these many deaths you do not die, which shadow your existence. For blindfolded creatures that you are, cringing at every step in apprehension of the stroke that perhaps is not to fail till old age, never raising a cup to your lips with the knowledge that you will live to quaff it, never sure that you will meet again the friend you part with for an hour, from those whose hearts no happiness suffices to banish the chill of an ever-present dread. What idea can you form of the godlike security with which we enjoy our lives and the lives of those we love? You have a saying on earth, tomorrow belongs to God. But here tomorrow belongs to us, even as today. To you, for some inscrutable purpose, he sees fit to dole out life moment by moment, with no assurance that each is not to be the last. To us, he gives a lifetime at once, 50, 60, 70 years, a divine gift indeed. A life such as yours would, I fear, seem of little value to us, for such a life, however long, is but a moment long, since that is all you can count on. And yet, I answered, though knowledge of the duration of your lives may give you an enviable feeling of confidence while the end is far off, is that not more than offset by the daily growing weight with which the expectation of the end, as it draws near, must press upon your minds? On the contrary, was the response, death, never an object of fear, as it draws near becomes more and more a matter of indifference to the moribund. It is because you live in the past that death is grievous to you. All your knowledge, all your affections, all your interests are rooted in the past, and on that account, as life lengthens, it strengthens its hold on you, and memory becomes a more precious possession. We, on the contrary, despise the past, and never dwell upon it. Memory with us, far from being the morbid and monstrous growth it is with you, is scarcely more than a rudimentary faculty. We live wholly in the future and the present. What with foretaste and actual taste, our experiences, whether pleasant or painful, are exhausted of interest by the time they are past. The accumulated treasures of memory, which you relinquish so painfully in death, we count no loss at all. Our minds being fed wholly from the future, we think and feel only as we anticipate. And so, as the dying man's future contracts, there is less and less about which he can occupy his thoughts. His interest in life diminishes as the ideas which it suggests grow fewer, till at last death finds him with his mind a tabula rasa, as with you at birth. In a word, his concern with life is reduced to a vanishing point before he is called on to give it up. In dying, he leaves nothing behind. And the after death, I asked, is there no fear of that? Surely, was the reply, it is not necessarily for me to say that a fear which affects only the more ignorant on earth is not known by all to us, and would be counted blasphemous. Moreover, as I have said, our foresight is limited to our lives on this planet. Any speculation beyond them would be purely conjectural, and our minds are repelled by the slightest taint of uncertainty. To us, the conjectural and the unthinkable may be called almost the same. But even if you do not fear death for itself, I said, you have hearts to break. Is there no pain when the ties of love are sundered? Love and death are not foes on our planet, was the reply. There are no tears by the bedsides of our dying. The same beneficent law which makes it so easy for us to give up life forbids us to mourn the friends we leave, or them to mourn us. With you, it is the intercourse you have had with friends that is the source of your tenderness for them. With us, it is the anticipation of the intercourse we shall enjoy which is the foundation of fondness. As our friends vanish from our future with the approach of their death, the effect on our thoughts and affections is as it would be with you if you forgot them by lapse of time. As our dying friends grow more and more indifferent to us, we, by operation of the same law of our nature, become indifferent to them, till at last we are scarcely more than kindly and sympathetic watchers about the beds of those who regard us equally without keen emotions. So at last God gently unwinds instead of breaking the bands that bind our hearts together, and makes death as painless to the surviving as to the dying. Relations meant to produce our happiness are not the means also of torturing us, as with you. Love means joy, and that alone to us, instead of blessing our lives for a while only to desolate them later on, compelling us to pay with a distinct and separate pang for every thrill of tenderness, exacting a tear for every smile. There are other partings than those of death. Are these too without sorrow for you? I asked. Assuredly, was the reply. Can you not see that so it must needs be with beings freed by foresight from the disease of memory? All the sorrow of parting, as of dying, comes with you from the backward vision which precludes you from beholding your happiness till it is past. Suppose your life destined to be blessed by happy friendship. If you could know it beforehand, it would be a joyous expectation, brightening the intervening years and cheering you as you traverse desolate periods. But no, not till you meet the one who is to be your friend do you know of him. Nor do you guess even then what he is to be to you, that you may embrace him at first sight. Your meeting is cold and indifferent. It is long before fire is fairly kindled between you, and then it is already time for parting. The fire burns well, but henceforth it must consume your heart. Not till they are dead or gone do you fully realize how dear your friends were, and how sweet was their companionship. But we see our friends afar coming to meet us, smiling already in our eyes, years before our ways meet. We greet them at first meeting, not coldly, not uncertainly, but with exultant kisses in an ecstasy of joy. They enter at once into the full possession of hearts long warmed and lighted for them. We meet with that delirium of tenderness with which you part. And when to us at last the time of parting comes, it only means that we are to contribute to each other's happiness no longer. We are not doomed like you in parting to take away with us the delight we brought our friends, leaving the ache of bereavement in its place, so that their last state is worse than their first. Parting here is like meeting with you, calm and unpassioned. The joys of anticipation and possession are the only food of love with us, and therefore love always wears a smiling face. With you he feeds on dead joys, past happiness, which are likewise the sustenance of sorrow. No wonder love and sorrow are so much alike on earth. It is a common saying among us that, were it not for the spectacle of the earth, the rest of the worlds would be unable to appreciate the goodness of God to them, and who can say that this is not the reason the piteous sight is set before us? You have told me marvelous things, I said, after I had reflected. It is indeed but reasonable that such a race as yours should look down with wondering pity on the earth. And yet, before I grant so much, I want to ask you one question. There is known in our world a certain sweet madness, under the influence of which we forget all that is unwanted in our lot, and would not change it for a god's. So far is this sweet madness regarded by men as a compensation, and more than a compensation, for all their miseries, that if you know not love as we know it, if this loss be the price you have paid for your divine foresight, we think ourselves more favored of God than you. Confess that love, with its reserves, its surprises, its mysteries, its revelations, is necessarily incompatible with a foresight which weighs and measures every experience in advance. Of love's surprises we certainly know nothing, was the reply. It is believed by our philosophers that the slightest surprise would kill beings of our constitution like lightning, though of course this is merely theory, for it is only by the study of earthly conditions that we are able to form an idea of what surprise is like. Your power to endure the constant buffetings of the unexpected is a matter of supreme amazement to us, nor, according to our ideas, is there any difference between what you call pleasant and painful surprises. You see then that we cannot envy you these surprises of love which you find so sweet, for to us they would be fatal. For the rest, there is no form of happiness which foresight is so well calculated to enhance as that of love. Let me explain to you how this befalls. As the growing boy begins to be sensible of the charms of woman, he finds himself, as I dare say it is with you, preferring some type of face and form to others. He dreams oftenest of fair hair, or maybe of dark, of blue eyes or brown. As the years go on, his fancy, brooding over what seems to it the best and loveliest of every type, is constantly adding to this dream face, this shadowy form, traits and lineaments, hues and contours, till at last the picture is complete, and he becomes aware that on his heart thus subtly has been depicted the likeness of the maiden destined for his arms. It may be years before he is to see her, but now begins with him one of the sweetest offices of love, one to you unknown. Youth on earth is a stormy period of passion, chafing in restraint or rioting in excess. But the very passion whose awakening makes this time so critical with you is here a reforming and educating influence, to whose gentle and potent sway we gladly confide our children. The temptations which lead our young men astray have no hold on a youth of our happy planet. He hoards the treasures of his heart for his coming mistress. Of her alone he thinks, and to her all his vows are made. The thought of license would be treasop to his sovereign lady, whose right to all the revenues of his being he joyfully owns. To rob her, to abate her high prerogatives, would be to impoverish, to insult himself, for she is to be his, and her honor, her glory are his own. Through all this time that he dreams of her by night and day, the exquisite reward of his devotion is the knowledge that she is aware of him as he of her, and that in the inmost shrine of a maiden heart his image is set up to receive the incense of a tenderness that needs not to restrain itself through fear of possible cross or separation. In due time their converging lives come together. The lovers meet, gaze a moment into each other's eyes, then throw themselves each on the other's breast. The maiden has all the charms that ever stirred the blood of an earthly lover, But there is another glamour over her which the eyes of earthly lovers are shut to, the glamour of the future. In the blushing girl her lover sees the fond and faithful wife, in the blithe maiden the patient, pain-consecrated mother. On the virgin's breast he beholds his children. He is prescient, even as his lids take the first fruits of hers, of the future years during which she is to be his companion, his ever-present solace, his chief portion of God's goodness. We have read some of your romances describing love as you know it on earth, and I must confess, my friend, we find them very dull. I hope, he added, as I did not speak at once, but I shall not offend you by saying we find them also objectionable. Your literature possesses in general an interest for us in the picture it presents of the curiosity, inverted life which the lack of foresight compelled you to lead. It is a study especially prized for the development of the imagination, on account of the difficulty of conceiving conditions so opposed to those of intelligent beings in general. But our women do not read your romances. The notion that a man or woman should ever conceive the idea of marrying a person other than the one whose husband or wife he or she is destined to be is profoundly shocking to our habits of thought. No doubt you will say that such instances are rare among you, but if your novels are faithful pictures of your life, they are at least not unknown. That these situations are inevitable under the conditions of earthly life, we are well aware, and judge you accordingly, but it is needless that the minds of our maidens should be pained by the knowledge that there anywhere exists a world where such travesties upon the sacredness of marriage are possible. It is, however, another reason why I've discouraged the use of your books by our young people, and that is the profound effect of sadness, to a race accustomed to view all things in the morning glow of the future, of a literature written in the past tense and relating exclusively to things that are ended. And how do you write of things that are past except in the past tense? I asked. We write of the past when it is still the future, and of course in the future tense, was the reply. If our historians were to wait till after the events to describe them, not alone would nobody care to read about things already done, but the histories themselves would probably be inaccurate, for memory, as I have said, is a very slightly developed faculty with us, and quite too indistinct to be trustworthy. Should the earth ever establish communications with us, you will find our histories of interest, for our planet, being smaller, cooled and was peopled ages before yours, and our astronomical records contain minute accounts of the earth from the time it was a fluid mass. Your geologists and biologists may yet find a mine of information here. In the course of our further conversation, it came out that, as a consequence of foresight, some of the commonest emotions of human nature are unknown on Mars. They for whom the future has no mystery can, of course, know neither hope nor fear. Moreover, everyone being assured that he shall attain to, and what not, there can be no such thing as rivalship, or emulation, or any sort of competition in any respect, and therefore all the brood of heart-burnings and hatreds engendered on earth by the strife of man with man is unknown to the people of Mars, save from the study of our planet. When I asked if there were not, after all, a lack of spontaneity, a sense of freedom, in leading lives fixed in all details beforehand, I was reminded that there was no difference in that respect between the lives of the people of Earth and of Mars, both alike being according to God's will in every particular. We knew that will only after the event, they before. That was all. For the rest, God moved them through their wills as he did us, so that they had no more dents of compulsion in what they did than we on earth have in carrying out an anticipated line of action, in cases where our anticipations chance to be correct. Of the absorbing interest which the study of the plan of their future lives possessed for the people of Mars, my companion spoke eloquently. It was, he said, like the fascination to a mathematician of a most elaborate and exquisite demonstration, a perfect algebraical equation with the glowing realities of life in place of figures and symbols. When I asked if it never occurred to them to wish their futures different, he replied that such a question could only have been asked by one from Earth. No one could have foresight or clearly believe that God had it, without realizing that the future is as incapable of being changed as the past. And not only this, but to foresee events was to foresee their logical necessity so clearly that to desire them different was as impossible as seriously to wish that 2 and 2 make 5 instead of 4. No person could ever thoughtfully wish anything different, for so closely are all things, the small with the great, woven together by God that to draw out the smallest thread would unravel creation through all eternity. While we had talked, the afternoon had waned, and the sun had sunk below the horizon, the roseate atmosphere of the planet imparting a splendor to the cloud coloring and a glory to the land and seascape never paralleled by an earthly sunset. Already the familiar constellations appearing in the sky reminded me how near, after all, I was to the earth. For with the unassisted eye, I could not detect the slightest variation in their position. Nevertheless, there was one wholly novel feature in the heavens, for many of the host of asteroids which circle in the zone between Mars and Jupiter were vividly visible to the naked eye. But the spectacle that chiefly held my gaze was the Earth, swimming low on the verge of the horizon. Its disk, twice as large as that of any star or planet as seen from the Earth, flashed with a brilliancy like that of Venus. "It is indeed a lovely sight," said my companion, although to me always a melancholy one, from the contrast suggested between the radiance of the orb and the benighted condition of its inhabitants. "We call it the blind man's world." As he spoke, he turned toward a curious structure which stood near us, though I had not before particularly observed it. "What is that?" I asked. "It is one of our telescopes," he replied. "I'm going to let you take a look, if you choose, at your home, and test for yourself the powers of which I have boasted." And having adjusted the instrument to his satisfaction, he showed me where to apply my eye to what answered to the eyepiece. I could not repress an exclamation of amazement, for truly he had exaggerated nothing. The little college town which was my home lay spread out before me, seemingly almost as near as when I looked down upon it from my observatory windows. It was early morning, and the village was waking up. The milkmen were going their rounds, and workmen with their dinner pails were hurrying along the streets. The early train was just leaving the railroad station. I could see the puffs from the smokestack and the jets from the cylinders. It was strange not to hear the hissing of the steam, so near I seemed. There were the college buildings on the hill, the long rows of windows flashing back the level sunbeams. I could tell the time by the college clock. It struck me that there was an unusual bustle around the buildings, considering the earliness of the hour. A crowd of men stood about the door of the observatory, and many others were hurrying across the campus in that direction. Among them I recognized Briston Bixby, accompanied by a college janitor. As I gazed, they reached the observatory, and, passing through the group about the door, entered the building. The president was evidently going up to my quarters. At this, it flashed over me quite suddenly that all this bustle was on my account. I recalled how it was that I came to be on Mars, and in what condition I had left affairs in the observatory. It was high time I were back there to look after myself. Here abruptly ended the extraordinary document which I found that morning on my desk. That is the authentic record of the conditions of life in another world which it purports to be. I do not expect the reader to believe. He will no doubt explain it as another of the curious freaks of somnambulism set down in the books. Probably it was merely that. Possibly it was something more. I do not pretend to decide the question. I have told all the facts of the case, and I have no better means of forming an opinion than the reader. Nor do I know, even if I fully believed it the true account it seems to be, that it would have affected my imagination much more strongly than it has. That story of another world has, in a word, put me out of joint with ours. The readiness with which my mind has adapted itself to the martial point of view concerning the earth has been a singular experience. The lack of foresight among the human faculties, a lack I had scarcely thought of before, now impresses me ever more deeply as a fact out of harmony with the rest of our nature, belying its promise, a moral mutilation, a deprivation arbitrary and unaccountable. The spectacle of a race doomed to walk backward, beholding only what has gone by, assured only of what is past and dead, comes over me from time to time with a sadly fantastical effect which I cannot describe. I dream of a world where love always wears a smile, where the partings are as tearless as our meetings, and death is king no more. I have a fancy, which I like to cherish, that the people of that happy sphere, fancied though it may be, represent the ideal and normal type of our race, as perhaps it once was, as perhaps it may yet be again. Citadel by Algis Budrys. He was looking for a privacy his strange personality needed, and never quite seemed to achieve it. All his efforts were, somehow, great triumphs of the race, and great failures for him. The aging man was sweating profusely, and he darted sidelong glances at the windowless walls of the outer office. By turns, he sat stiffly in a corner chair, or paced uneasily, his head swiveling constantly. His hand was clammy when Meade shook it. "Hello, Mr. Meade," he said in a husky, hesitant voice, his eyes never quite still, never long on Meade's face, but darting hither and yon, his glance rebounding at every turn from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the closed outer door. Christopher Meade, Assistant Undersecretary for External Affairs, returned the handshake, smiling. "Please come into my office," he said quickly. "It's much more spacious." "Thank you," the aging man said gratefully and hurried into the next room. Meade rapidly opened the windows, and some of the man's nervousness left him. He sank down into the visitor's chair in front of Meade's desk, his eyes drinking in the distances beyond the windows. "Thank you," he repeated. Meade sat down behind his desk, leaned back, and waited for the man's breathing to slow. Finally he said, "It's good to see you again, Mr. Holliday. What can I do for you?" Martin Holliday tore his glance away from the window long enough to raise his eyes to Meade's face, and then drop them to the hands he had folded too deliberately in his lap. His voice husked into unintelligibility, and he had to begin again. I'd like to take an option on a new planet," he finally said. Meade nodded. "I don't see why not." He gestured expressively at the star chart papered over one wall of his office. "We've certainly got plenty of them, but what happened with your first one?" Mr. Holliday, I certainly won't be offended if you prefer to look out the window," Meade said quickly. "Thank you." After a moment, he began again. "It didn't work out," he said, his glance flickering back to Meade for an instant before he had to look out the window again. "I don't know where my figuring went wrong. It didn't go wrong. It was just things. I thought I could sell enough subdivisions to cover the payments and still keep most of it for myself, but it didn't work out." He looked quickly at Meade with a flash of groundless guilt in his eyes. "First, I had to sell more than I had intended, because I had to lower the original price. Somebody'd optioned another planet in the same system, and I hadn't counted on the competition. Then, even after I'd covered the option and posted surety on the payments, there were all kinds of expenses. I couldn't lease the mineral rights." He looked at Meade again, as though he had to justify himself. "I don't know how that deal fell through. The company just withdrew, all of a sudden." Do you think there might have been anything peculiar about that? Meade asked. I mean, could the company have made a deal with the colonists for a lower price after you'd been forced out? Holliday shook his head quickly. No, nothing like that. The colonists and I got along fine. It wasn't as though I hadn't put the best land up for sale, or tried to make myself rich. Why, after I had to sell some of the remaining land, I knew it wasn't worth staying anymore. Some of them offered to lend me enough money to keep 50,000 square miles for myself. He smiled warmly, his eyes blank while he focused on memory. But that wasn't it, of course, he went on. I had my original investment back, but I couldn't tell them why I couldn't stay. It was people, even if I never saw them. It was the thought of people, with aircraft and rockets and roads. I understand, Mr. Holliday, Meade said in an effort to spare him embarrassment. Holliday looked at him helplessly. I couldn't tell them that, could I, Mr. Meade? They were good, friendly people who wanted to help me. I couldn't tell them it was people, could I? He wet his dry lips and locked his eyes on the view outside the window. All I want, Mr. Meade, is half a planet to myself, he said softly. He shook his head. Well, it'll work out this time. This time I won't have to sell so much, and I'll have a place to spend what time I've got left in peace. Without this. He gestured helplessly in an effort to convey his tortured consciousness of his own fear. Meade nodded quickly as he saw his features nod convulsively. Of course, Mr. Holliday. We'll get you an option on a new planet as quickly as we can. Thank you, Holliday said again. Can we handle it today? I've had my credit transferred to a local bank. Certainly, Mr. Holliday. We won't keep you on Earth a moment longer than absolutely necessary. He took a standard form out of a desk drawer and passed it to Holliday for a signature. I'll be smarter this time, the aging man said, trying to convince himself as he uncapped his pen. This time it'll work out. I'm sure it will, Mr. Holliday, Meade said. Martel was a beast. He sat behind his desk like a tuskless sea lion crouched behind a rock, and his cheeks merged into jowls and obliterated his neck. His desk was built specially so that he could get his thighs under it. His office chair was heavier and wider by far than any standard size, his casters rolling on special composition base that had been laid down over the carpeting, for Marlowe's weight would have cut any ordinary rug to shreds. His jacket stretched like a pleo film to enclose the bulk of his stooped shoulders, and his eyes surveilled his world behind the embattle-mended heaviness of the puffing flesh that filled their sockets. A bulb flickered on his interphone set, and Marlowe shot a glance at the switch beneath it. Secretary, quite contrary, he muttered inaudibly. He flicked the switch. Yes, Mary. His voice rumbled out of the flabby cavern of his chest. Mr. Meade has just filed a report on Martin Holliday, Mr. Secretary. Would you like to see it? Just give me a summary, Mary. Under his breath, he whispered, Summary that mummery, Mary, and a thin smile fell about his lips while he listened. Gave him Carlshaven 4A, he observed when his secretary finished. Okay, thanks, Mary. He switched off and sat thinking. Somewhere in the bowels of the body administrative, he knew, notations were being made and cross-filed. The addition of Carlshaven 4 to the list of planets under colonization would be made, and Holliday's asking prices for land would be posted with immigration, together with a prospectus extracted from the General Galactic Survey. He switched the interphone on again. Mary, supply me with a copy of the GenServe on the entire Carlshaven system. Tell Mr. Meade I'll expect him in my office sometime this afternoon. You schedule it, and we'll go into it further. Yes, Mr. Secretary. Will 15:15 be all right? 15:15's fine, Mary, Martel said gently. Yes, sir, his secretary replied, abashed. I keep forgetting about proper nomenclature. So do I, Mary, so do I, Martel sighed. Anything come up that wasn't scheduled for today? It was a routine question, born of futile hope. There was always something to spoil the carefully planned daily schedules. Yes and no, sir. Martel cocked an eyebrow at the interphone. Well, that's a slight change anyway. What is it? There's a political science observer from Dovenel, that's more two on our map, sir, who requested permission to talk to you. He's here on the usual exchange program, and he's within his privileges in asking, of course. I assume it's an ordinary thing. What's our foreign policy? How do you apply it? Can you give specific instances and the like? Precisely, Martel thought. For ordinary questions, there were standard answers, and Mary had been his secretary for so long that she could supply them as well as he could. Dovenel, more to a... Obviously, there was something special about the situation, and Mary was leaving the decision to him. He scanned through his memorized star catalogs, trying to find the correlation. Mr. Secretary, Martel grunted, still here, just thinking. Isn't Dovenel that nation we just sent Harrison to? Yes, sir, on the same exchange program. Martel chuckled. Well, if we've got Harrison down there, it's only fair to let their fellow learn something in exchange, isn't it? What's his name? Daily Shoot Claven, sir. Martel muttered to himself. Daily Shoot Clavan, Irish corned beef and cabbage. His mind filed it away together with a primary color picture of Jigs and Maggie. All right, Mary, I'll talk to him, if you can find room in the schedule somewhere. Tell you what, let him in at 15:30. Mead and I can finish a working example for him. Does that check all right with your book? Yes, sir. There'll be time if we carry over on the Saroe incidents. Saroe's waited 6 years, 4 months, and 23 days. They'll wait another day. Let's do that, then. Mary. Martel switched off and picked up a report which he began to read by the page block system, his eyes almost unblinking between pages. Harrison, eh? He muttered once, stopping to look quizzically at his desktop. He chuckled. At 15:15, the light on his interphone blinked twice, and Martel hastily initialed a directive with his right hand while touching the switch with his left. Yes, Mary. Mr. Mead, sir. Okay. He switched off, pushed the directive into his outbox, and pulled the GenSurf and the folder on Martin Holliday out of the whole tray. Come in, Chris, he said as Mead knocked on the door. How are you today, Mr. Marlowe? Mead asked as he sat down. 4 ounces heavier, Martel answered dryly. I presume you're not. Cigarette, Chris? Apparently, the use of the first name finally caught Mead's notice. He looked thoughtful for a moment, then took a cigarette and lit it. Thanks, Dave. Well, I'm glad that's settled, Martel chuckled, his eyes almost disappearing in wrinkles of flesh. How's Mary? Mead grinned crookedly. Miss Folsom is in fine fettle today, thank you. Martel rumbled a laugh. Mead at once made the mistake of addressing the woman as Mary, under the natural assumption that if Martel could do it, everyone could. Mary, I fear, Martel observed, lives in more stately times than these. She'll tolerate informality from me because I'm in direct authority over her, and direct authority, of course, is law. But you, Mead, are a young whippersnapper. But that's totally unrealistic, Mead protested. I don't respect her less by using her first name. It's just friendliness, that's all. Look, Martel said, it makes sense, but it ain't logical, not on her terms. Mary Folsom was raised by a big, tough, tight-lipped authoritarian of a father who believed in bringing kids up by the book. By the time she got tumbled out into the world, all big men were unquestionable authority, and all young men were callow whippersnappers. Sure, she's unhappy about it inside, but it makes her a perfect secretary for me, and she does her job well. We play by her rules on the little things, and by the world's rules on the big ones, capiche? Sure, Dave, but... Marlowe picked up the folder on Holiday and gave Mead one weighty but understanding look before he opened it. Your trouble, Chris, is that your viewpoint is fundamentally sane, he said. Now about Holiday. Martin. Options. 06-26-8729, 063-108-1004. I didn't get time to read the gen serve on the Carlshaven planets, so I'll ask you to brief me. Yes, sir. What's Ford like? Good, arable land. A little mountainous in spots, but that's good. Loaded with minerals, industrial stuff, like silver. Some tin, but not enough to depress the monetary standard. Lots of copper. Coal beds, petroleum basins, the works. Self-supporting practically from the start. A real asset to the Union in 56 years. Martel got. Good. Nice picking, Chris. Now, got a decoy? Yes, sir. Carlshaven 2's a falsy. I've got a dummy option on it in the works, and will be able to undercut Holiday's prices for his land by about 20%. Falsy, how long do you figure until the colony can't stick on it any longer? A fair-sized one, with lots of financial backing, might even make it permanently. But we won't be able to take up that many loafers, and naturally, we can't give them that big a subsidy. Eventually, we'll have to ferry them all out, in about 8 years, say. But that'll give us enough time to break Holiday. Marlowe nodded again. Sounds good. Something else, Meade said. Two's mineral poor. He looked hesitantly at Marlowe. What's up, boy? Well, sir, Meade began, then stopped. Nothing important, really. Marlowe gave him a surprising look full of sadness and brooding understanding. You're thinking he's an old, frightened man, and why don't we leave him alone? Wife, yes, sir. Dave. Yes, Dave. You're quite right. Why don't we? We can't, sir. I know that, but it doesn't seem fair. Exactly, Chris. It ain't right, but it's correct. The light on Marlowe's interphone blinked once. Marlowe looked at it in momentary surprise. Then his features cleared, and he muttered, "Cabbage." He reached out toward the switch. We've got a visitor, Chris. Follow my lead. He reviewed his information on Devonalid titular systems while he touched the switch. Ask Scott Claven to come in, Mary. Daily Shut Claven was almost a twin for the pictured typical Devonalid in Marlowe's library. Since the pictures were usually idealized, it followed that Claven was an above-average specimen of his people. He stood a full 8 feet from feathers to crest, and had not yet begun to thicken his toes in compensation for the stoop that marked advancing middle age for his race. Marlowe, looking at him, smiled inwardly. No Devonalid could be so obviously superior and still only a lowly student. Well, considering Harrison's qualifications, it might still not be tit for tat. Meade began to get to his feet, and Marlowe hastily planted a foot atop his nearest shoe. The assistant winced and twitched his lips, but at least he stayed down. Davy Shoot Claven, the Devonalid pronounced in good English. David Marlowe, Secretary for External Affairs, Solar Union, Marlowe replied. Ood Claven looked expectantly at Meade. Christopher Meade, Assistant Undersecretary for External Affairs, the assistant said, orienting himself. If you would do us the honor of permitting us to stand, Marlowe asked politely. On the contrary, Marlowe, if you would do me the honor of permitting me to sit, I should consider it a privilege. Please do so, Mr. Meade, if you would bring our visitor a chair. They lost themselves in formalities for a few minutes, Marlowe being urbanely correct. Meade following after as best he could through the maze of Devonalid mores. Finally, they were able to get down to the business at hand. Ood Claven sitting with considerable comfort in the carefully designed chair which could be snapped into almost any shape. Marlowe bulking behind his desk, Meade sitting somewhat nervously beside him. Now, as I understand it, Ood Claven, Marlowe began, you'd like to learn something of our policies and methods. That is correct, Marlowe and Meade. The Devonalid extracted a block of opaque material from the flat wallet at his side and steadied it on his knee. I have your permission to take notes. Please do. Now, as it happens, Mr. Meade and I are currently considering a case which perfectly illustrates our policies. Claven immediately traced a series of ideographs on the note block, and Martel wondered if he was actually going to take their conversation down verbatim. He shrugged mentally. He'd have to ask him at some later date whether he'd missed anything. Undoubtedly, there'd be a spare recording of the tape he himself was making. To begin, as you know, our government is founded upon principles of extreme personal freedom. There are no arbitrary laws governing expression, worship, the possession of personal weapons, or the rights of personal property. The state is construed to be a mechanism of public service, operated by the body politic, and the actual regulation and regimentation of society is accomplished by natural socio-economic laws, which, of course, are both universal and unavoidable. We pride ourselves on the high status of the individual in comparison to the barely tolerable existence of the state. We do, naturally, have ordinances and injunctions governing crimes, but even these are usually superseded by civil action at the personal level. Martel leaned forward a trifle. Forgetting exact principles for a moment, Outclaven, you realize that the actuality will sometimes stray from the ideal. Our citizens, for example, do not habitually carry weapons except under extraordinary conditions. But that is a civil taboo, rather than a fixed amendation of our Constitution. I have no doubt that some future generation, mores having shifted, will, for example, revive the Code Dwello. Outclaven nodded. Quite understood. Thank you, Martel. Good. Now to proceed. Under conditions such as those, the state and its agencies cannot lay down a fixed policy of any sort and expect it to be in the least permanent. The people will not tolerate such regulation, and with each new shift in social mores, and the institution of any policy is itself sufficient to produce such a shift within a short time, successive policies are repudiated by the body politic, and new ones must be instituted. Martel leaned back and spread his hands. Therefore, he said with a rueful smile, it can be fairly said that we have no foreign policy, effectively speaking. We pursue the expedient, Outclaven, and hope for the best. The case which Mr. Meade and I are currently considering is typical. The Union, as you know, maintains a General Survey Corps whose task it is to map the galaxy, surveying such planets as harbor alien races or seem suitable for human colonization. Such a survey team, for example, first established contact between your people and ours. Exchange observation rights are worked out, and representatives of both races are given the opportunity to acquaint themselves with the society of the other. In the case of unoccupied, habitable planets, however, the state's function ceases with the filing of a complete and definitive survey at the Under-Ministry for Immigration. The state, as the state, sponsors no colonies and makes no establishments except for the few staging bases which are maintained for the use of the Survey Corps. We have not yet found any need for the institution of an offensive service analogous to a planetary army, nor do we expect to. War in space is possible only under extraordinary conditions, and we foresee no such contingency. All our colonization is carried out by private citizens who apply to Mr. Meade here for options on suitable unoccupied planets. Mr. Meade's function is to act as a consultant in these cases. He maintains a roster of surveyed human habitable planets and either simply signs the requested planet or recommends one to fit specified conditions. The cost of the option is sufficient to cover the administrative effort involved, together with sufficient profit to the government to finance further surveys. The individual holding the option is then referred to Immigration, which provides copies of a prospectus taken from the General Survey Report and advertises the option holders asking prices on subdivisions. Again, there is a reasonable fee of a nature similar to ours, devoted to the same purposes. Then the state ceases to have any voice in the projected colonization whatsoever. It is a totally private enterprise, a simple real estate operation, if you will, with the state acting only as an advertising agency, and occasionally as the lessor of suitable transportation from Earth to the new planet. The colonists, of course, are under our protection, maintaining full citizenship unless they request independence, which is freely granted. If you would like to see it for purposes of clarification, you're welcome to examine our file on Martin Holliday, a citizen who is fairly typical of these real estate operators, and who has just filed an option on his second planet. Smiling, Marlowe extended the folder. "Thank you, I should like to," Ood Cleven said, and took the file from Marlowe. He leafed through it rapidly, pausing after asking Marlowe's leave to make notes on some of the information, and then handed it back. "Most interesting," Ood Cleven observed. "However, if you'll enlighten me, this man Martin Holliday, wouldn't there seem to be very little incentive for him, considering his age, even if there is the exception of a high monetary return, particularly since his first attempt, while not a failure, was not an outstanding financial success?" Marlowe shrugged helplessly. "I tend to agree with you thoroughly, Ood Cleven. But," he smiled, "you'll agree, I'm sure, that one Earthman's boredom is another's incentive. We are not a rigorously logical race, Ood Cleven." "Quite," the Divanolid replied. Marlowe stared at his irrevocable clock. His interphone light flickered, and he touched the switch absently. "Yes, Mary. Will there be anything else, Mr. Secretary?" "No, thank you, Mary. Good night." "Good night, sir." There was no appeal. The day was over, and he had to go home. He stared helplessly at his empty office, his mind automatically counting the pairs of departing footsteps that sounded momentarily as clerks and stenographers crossed the walk below his partly open window. Finally, he rolled his chair back and pushed himself to his feet. Disconsolate, he moved irresolutely to the window and watched the people leave. Washington, aging, crowded Washington, mazed by narrow streets, carrying the burden of the severe, unimaginative past on its grimy architecture, respired heavily under the sinking sun. The capital ought to be moved, he thought, as he thought every night at this time. Nearer the heart of the empire, out of this steamy bog, out of this warren. His heavy lips moved into an ironical comment on his own thoughts. No one was ever going to move the empire's traditional seat. There was too much nostalgia concentrated here, along with the humidity. Someday, when the Union was contiguous with the entire galaxy, men would still call Washington, an old, out-of-the-way Earth, their capital. Man was not a rigorously logical race as a race. The thought of going home broke out afresh, insidiously avoiding the barriers of bemusement which he had tried to erect, and he turned abruptly away from the window, moving decisively so as to be able to move at all. He yanked open a desk drawer and stuffed his jacket pockets with candy bars, ripping the film from one and chewing it on his hand while he put the papers in his briefcase. Finally, he could not delay any longer. Everyone else was out of the building, and the robots were taking over. Metal treads spun along the corridors, bearing brooms, and the robot switchboards guarded the communications of the ministry. Soon, the Jar robots would be bustling into this very office. He sighed and walked slowly out, down the empty halls where no human eye could see him waddling. He stepped into his car, and as he opened the door, the automatic recording said, "Home, please," in his own voice. The car waited until he was settled and then accelerated gently, pointing for his apartment. The recording had been an unavoidable but vicious measure of his own. He'd had to resort to it, for the temptation to drive to a terminal, to an airport, or a rocket field, or a railroad station, anywhere, had become excruciating. The car stopped for a pedestrian light, and a sports model bounced jauntily to a stop beside it. The driver cocked an eyebrow at Marlowe and chuckled. "Hey, fatso, Which one of you is the Buick? Then the light changed. The car spurted away and left Marlowe cringing. He would not get an official car and protect himself with its license number. He would not be a coward. He would not. His fingers shaking, he tore the film from another candy bar. Marlowe huddled in his chair, the notebook clamped on one broad thigh by his heavy hand, his lips mumbling nervously while his pencil point checked off meter. Dwelling aching discontent, he muttered, "No, not that." He stared down at the floor, his eyes distant. "Bitter discontent," he whispered. He grunted softly with breath that had to force his way past the constricting weight of his hunched chest. "Bittered well." He crossed out the third line, substituted the new one, and began to read the first two verses to himself. "We are born of humankind. This is our destiny, to bitter dwell in discontent wherever we may be, to struggle with the burden of that which feels on us, to stake our fresh beginnings when frailer breeds have done." He smiled briefly, content. It still wasn't perfect, but it was getting closer. He continued, "To pile upon the ashes of races in decease, such citadels of our kind's own, as fortify no." "What are you doing, David?" his wife asked over his shoulder. Flinching, he pulled a notebook closer into his lap, bending forward in an instinctive effort to protect it. The warm, loving, sighing voice went on. "Are you writing another poem, David? Why, I thought you'd given that up." It's nothing really. Oh, Leonora, nothing much, just a thing I've had running around in my head. Wanted to get rid of it." His wife leaned over and kissed his cheek clumsily. "Why, you big old dear, I'll bet it's for me. Isn't it, David? Isn't it for me?" He shook his head in almost desperate regret. I'm afraid not, Snorer. It's about something else, Leonora." "Oh." She came around the chair and he furtively wiped his cheek with a hasty hand. She sat down facing him, smiling with entreaty. "Would you read it to me anyway, David? Please, dear." "Well, it's not finished yet. Not right." "You don't have to, David. It's not important. Not really." She sighed deeply. He picked up the notebook, his breath cold in his constricted throat. "All right," he said, the words coming out huskily. "I'll read it, but it's not finished yet. If you don't want to." He began to read hurriedly, his eyes locked on the notebook, his voice a suppressed or spasmodic whisper. "Such citadels of our own kind, as fortify no peace, no wall can offer shelter, no roof can shield from pain. We cannot rest, we are the damned, we must go forth again, unnumbered we must." "David, are you sure about those last lines?" She smiled apologetically. "I know I'm old-fashioned, but couldn't you change that? It seems so harsh, and I think you may have unconsciously borrowed it from someone else. I can't help thinking I've heard it before somewhere. Don't you think so?" "Oh, I don't know, my dear. You may be right about that word, but it doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, I'm not going to try to get it published or anything." "I know, dear, but still." He was looking at her desperately. "I'm sorry, dear," she said contritely. "Please go on. Don't pay any attention to my stupid comments. They're not stupid. Please, dear, go on." His fingers clamped the edge of the notebook. "Unnumbered we must wander, break and bleed and die. Implacable as the ocean, our tide must drown the sky. What is our expiation? For what primeval crime, that we must go on marching until the crash of time? What hand has shaped so cruelly? What whim has cast such fate? Where is in our creation the botch that makes us great?" "Oh, that's good, darling. That's very good. I'm proud of you, David." "I think it stinks," he said evenly. "But anyway, there are 2 more verses." "David." Grimly, he spat out the last 8 lines. "Why are we ever gimleted by empire's irony, or discontent the cancer prize of Earthman's galaxy?" Leonora, recoiling from this cold fury, was a shaking pair of shoulders in a mass of lank hair supported by her hands on her face while she sobbed. or our souls so much perverted we cannot relent, or the stars the madman's caused, for his inborn discontent. Good night, Leonora. The light flickered on Martle's interphone. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Good morning, Mary. What's up? Harrison's being deported from Davenil, sir. There's a civil crime charged against him, quite a serious one. Martle's eyebrows went up. How much have we got on it? Not too much, sir. Harrison's report hasn't come in yet. But the story's on the news broadcast now, sir. We haven't been asked to comment yet, but immigration has been called by several news outlets, and the Ministry for Education just called here and inquired whether it would be all right to publish a general statement of their exchange students' careful instructions against violating local customs. Martle's glance brooded down the mass of papers piled in the tray of his inbox. Give me a tape of a typical broadcast, he said at last. Hold everything else. Prison explanation to all news outlets. None now. Statement forthcoming after preliminary investigation later in the day. The ministry regrets this incident deeply and will try to settle matters as soon and as amicably as possible, etc., etc. Okay. Yes, sir. He swung his chair around to face the screen, led into a side wall, and colors began to flicker and run in the field almost immediately. He steadied and sharpened, and the broadcast tape began to roll. Tape line. Dovenel, Sector 3, Day 183, 2417 GST. Your local news reporter on this small planet at the Union's Rim was unable today to locate for comment any of the high officials of this alien civilization directly concerned with the order for the deportation of exchange student observer Hubert Harrison, charged with theft and violent assault on the person of a Davenil citizen. Union citizen Harrison was unavailable for comment at this time, but Topical News will present his views and other such clues when more ensues. Marlowe grunted. Journalese was getting out of hand again. That last rhyming sentence was sure to stick in the audience's brains. It might be only another advertising gimmick, but if they start doing it with the body of the news itself, it might well be to feed Topical enough false leads to destroy what little reputation for comprehensibility they had left. He touched his interphone switch. Mary, what was the hooper on that broadcast? Under 1%, sir. Which meant that so far, the body politic hadn't been reached. Thank you. Is there anything else coming in? Not at the moment, sir. What, cabbage? What's Dalishu and Claven doing? His residence is the Solar Hotel, sir. The management reports that he is still in his room and has not reserved space on any form of long-distance transportation. He has not contacted us either, and there's a strong probability that he may still be unaware of what's happened. How many calls did he make yesterday, either before or after he was here, and to whom? I can get you a list in 10 minutes, sir. Do that, Mary. He switched off, sat slapping the edge of his desk with his hand, and switched on again. Mary, I want the gensers on the Dovenil area to a depth of 10 cubic lights. Yes, sir. And get me Mr. Meat on the phone, please. Yes, sir. Martle's lips pulled back from his teeth as he switched off. He snatched a candy bar out of his drawer, tore the film partway off, then threw it back in the drawer as his desk phone chimed. Here, Chris. Here, Mr. Marlowe. Look, Chris, has Holiday left Earth yet? Yes, sir, yes, Dave. Where is he? Luna en route to Carlshaven. He was lucky enough to have me arrange for his accidentally getting a ride on a Gensurf ship that happened to be going out that way, if you follow me. Meat grinned. Get him back. The smile blanked out. I can't do that, Mr. Marlowe. He'd never be able to take it. You should have seen him when I put him on the shuttle. We doped him up with easy rest, and even then his subconscious could feel the bulkheads around him, even in his sleep. Those shuttles are small, and they don't have ports. We can't help that. We need him, and I got to talk to him first, personally. Meat bit his lip. Yes, sir. Dave. Yes, Dave. stately Shoot Claven sat easily in his chair opposite Marlowe. He rested one digit on his notebook and waited. Oot Claven, Marlowe said amiably. You're undoubtedly aware by now that your opposite number on Dovenel has been charged with a civil crime and deported. The Devonalid nodded. An unfortunate incident, one that I regret personally, and which I am sure my own people would much rather not have had happen. Naturally, Barrow smiled. I simply wanted to reassure you that this incident does not reflect on your own status in any way. We are investigating our representative and will take appropriate action, but it seems quite clear that the fault is not with your people. We have already forwarded reparations and a note of apology to your government. As for the reparation, I wish to assure you personally that we will cooperate with your personal observations in every possible way. If there is anything at all you wish to know, even that might, under ordinary conditions, be considered restricted information, just call on us. Hud Claven's crest stirred a fraction of an inch, and Marlowe chuckled inwardly. Well, even a brilliant spy might be forgiven an outward display of surprise under these circumstances. The Devonalid gave him a piercing look, but Marlowe presented a featureless facade of bulk. The secretary chuckled in his mind once more. He doubted if Hud Claven would accept the hypothesis that Marlowe did not know that he was a spy, but the Devonalid must be a sorely confused being at this point. Thank you, Marlowe, he said finally. I am most grateful. I am sure my people will construe it as yet another sign of the Union's friendship. I hope so, Hud Claven, Marlowe replied. Having exchanged his last friendly lie, they went through the customary Novenalid formula of leave-taking. Marlowe slapped his interphone switch as soon as the alien was gone. Mary was the latest on holiday. His shuttle lands at Idlewild in half an hour, sir. All right, get Mr. Meade, have him meet me out front, and get an official car to take us to the field. I want somebody from immigration to go with us. Call Idlewild and have them set up a desk and chairs for 4 out in the middle of the field. Call the Ministry for Traffic and make sure that field stays clear until we're through with it. My ministerial prerogative and no backtalk. I want that car in 10 minutes. Yes, sir. Mary's voice was perfectly even, without the slightest hint that there was anything unusual happening. Marlowe switched off and twisted his mouth. He picked up the GenServe on the Novenil area and began skimming it rapidly. He kept his eyes carefully front as he walked out of his office, past the battery of clerks in the outer office, and he kept them rigidly fixed on the door of his personal elevator, which, during the day, was human-operated under the provisions of the Human Employment Act of 2302. He met Meade in front of the building and did not look into the eyes of Boussard, the man from immigration, as they shook hands. He followed them down the walk in a sweaty agony of obliviousness and climbed into the car with carefully normal lack of haste. He sat sweating, chewing a candy bar for several minutes before he spoke. Then slowly, he felt his battered defenses reassert themselves, and he could actually look at Boussard before he turned to Meade. Now that he rapped out a shade too abruptly before he caught himself. Here's the GenServe on the Doenel area, Chris. Anything in it you don't know already? I don't think so, sir. Okay, dig me up a habitable planet. Even a long-term Falsey will do, close to Dovenel, but not actually in their system. If it is at all possible, I want that world in a system without any rich planets, and I don't want any rich systems anywhere near it. If you can't do that, arrange for the outright sale of all mineral and other resource rights to suitable companies. I want that planet to be habitable, but I want it to be impossible for any people on it to get at enough resources to achieve a technological culture. Can do. Meade shook his head. I don't know. You've got about 15 minutes to find out. I'm going to start talking to Holiday, and when I tell him I've got another planet for him, I'll be depending on you to furnish one. Sorry to pile it on like this, but must be. Meade nodded. right, Mr. Marlowe. That's why I drop A. Good boy. Now, Rabbit, Gusard, I want you to be ready to lay out a complete advertising and prospectus program. Straight routine work, but about 4 times normal speed. The toughest part of it will be following the lead that Chris and I set. Don't be surprised at anything, and act like it happens every day. Yes, Mr. Marlowe. Right. Boussard looked uncomfortable. Mr. Marlowe. Yes. About this man Harrison. I presume all this is the result of what happened to him on Dovenil. Do you think there's any foundation in truth for what they say he did? Or do you think it's just an excuse to get him off their world? Marlowe looked at him coldly. Don't be an ass, he snorted. Martin Holliday climbed slowly out of the shuttle's log and moved fumblingly down the stairs, leaning on the attendant's arm. His face was a molded gray, and his hand shook uncontrollably. He stepped down to the tarmac, and his head turned from side to side as his eyes gulped in the field's distances. Marlowe sat behind the desk that had been put up in the middle of its emptiness, his eyes brooding as he looked at Holliday. Boussard stood beside him, trying nervously to appear non-committal, while Meade went up to the shaking old man, grasped his hand, and brought him over to the desk. Marlowe shifted uncomfortably. The desk was standard size, and he had to sit far away from it. He could not feel at ease in such a position. His thick fingers went into the side pocket of his jacket and peeled the film off a candy bar, and he began to eat it, holding it in his left hand, as Meade introduced Holliday. How do you do, Mr. Holliday? Marlowe said, his voice higher than he would have liked it, and he shook the man's hand. I'm quite pleased to meet you, Mr. Secretary, Holliday replied. His eyes were darting past Marlowe's head. This is Mr. Boussard of Immigration, and you know Mr. Meade, of course. Now I think we can all sit down. Meade's chair was next to Holliday's, and Boussard's was to one side of the desk, so that only Marlowe, unavoidably, blocked his complete view of the stretching tarmac. First of all, Mr. Holliday, I'd like to thank you for coming back. Please believe me when I say we would not have made such request if were not urgently necessary. It's all right, Holliday said in a slow, apologetic voice. I don't mind. Marlowe winced, but he had to go on. Have you seen the news broadcast recently, Mr. Holliday? The man shook his head in embarrassment. No, sir, I've been asleep most of the time. I understand, Mr. Holliday. I didn't really expect you had under the circumstances. The situation is this. Some time ago, our survey ships, working out in their usual expanding pattern, encountered an alien civilization on a world designated Moor 2 on our maps, and which the natives called Dovenil. It was largely a routine matter, no different from any other alien contact which we've had. They had a relatively high technology, embracing the beginnings of interplanetary flight, and our contract teams were soon able to work out a diplomatic status mutually satisfactory to both. Social observers were exchanged in accordance with the usual practice, and everything seemed to be going well. Holliday nodded out of painful politeness, not seeing the connection with himself. Some of his nervousness was beginning to fade, but it was impossible for him to be really at ease with so many people near him, with all of Earth's billions lurking at the edge of the tarmac. However, Marlowe went on as quickly as he could. Today our representative was deported on a trumped-up charge. Undoubtedly, this is only the first move in some complicated scheme directed against the Union. What it is, we do not know yet. But further observation of the actions of their own representative on this planet has convinced us that they are a clever, ruthless people, living in a society which would have put Machiavelli to shame. They are single-minded of purpose, and welding into a tight group whose major purpose in life is the service of the state in its major purpose, which, by all indications, is that of eventually dominating the universe. You know our libertarian society. You know that the Union government is almost powerless, and that the Union itself is nothing but a loose federation composed of a large number of independent nations tied together by very little more than the fact that we are all Earth of such a nation as the Dovenil is. They have already outmaneuvered us once, despite our best efforts. There is no sign that they will not be able to do so again, at will. We must somehow discover what the Dovenilids intend to do next. For this reason, I earnestly request that you accept our offer of another planet than the one you have optioned, closer to the Dovenilid system. We are willing, under these extraordinary circumstances, to consider your credit sufficient for the outright purchase of half the planet, and Mr. Broussard here will do his utmost to get you suitable colonists for the other half as rapidly as it can be done. Will you help us, Mr. Holliday? Marlowe sank back in his chair. He became conscious of a messy feeling in his left hand, and looked down to discover the half-eaten candy bar had melted. He tried furtively to wipe his hand clean on the underside of the desk, but he knew Broussard had noticed, and he cringed and cursed himself. Holliday's face twisted nervously. Please don't misunderstand us, Mr. Holliday, Marlowe said. We do not intend to ask you to spy for us, nor are we acting with the intention of now establishing a base of any sort on the planet. We simply would like to have a Union world near the Dovenilid system. Whatever Dovenil does will not have gathered significant momentum by the end of your life. You will be free to end your days exactly as you have always wished, and the precautions we have outlined will ensure that there will be no encroachments on your personal property during that time. We are planning for the next generation, when Dovenil will be initiating its program of expansion. It is then that we will need an established outpost near their borders. Yes, Holliday said hesitantly. I can understand that. I don't know, he repeated. It seems all right, and as you say, it won't matter during my lifetime, and it's more than I'd really hoped for. He looked nervously at Meade. What do you think, Mr. Meade? You've always done your best for me. Meade shot one quick glance at Marlowe. I think Mr. Marlowe is doing his best for the Union, he said finally, and I know he's fully aware of your personal interests. I think what he's doing is reasonable under the circumstances, and I think his proposition to you, as he's outlined it, is something which you cannot afford to not consider. The final decision is up to you, of course. Holliday nodded slowly, staring down at his hands. Yes, I think you're right, Mr. Meade. He looked up at Marlowe. I'll be glad to help, and I'm grateful for the consideration you have shown me. Not at all, Mr. Holliday. The Union is in your debt. Marlowe wiped his hand on the underside of the desk again, but he only made matters worse, for his fingers picked up some of the chocolate he had removed before. Mr. Meade, will you give Mr. Holliday the details on the new planet, he said, trying to get his handkerchief out without smearing his suit. He could almost hear Broussard snickering. Holliday signed the new option contract and shook Marlowe's hand. I'd like to thank you again, sir. Looking at it from my point of view, it is something for nothing, at least, while I'm alive. And it's a very nice planet, too, from the way Mr. Meade described it, even better than Carlshaven. Nevertheless, Mr. Holliday, Marlowe said, you have done the Union a great service. We would consider it an honor if you allowed us to enter your planet in our records under the name of Holliday. He kept his eyes away from Meade. Martin Holliday's eyes were shining. Thank you, Mr. Marlowe, he said huskily. Marlowe could think of no reply. Finally, he simply nodded. It's been a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Holliday. We've arranged transportation, and your shuttle will be taking off very shortly. Holliday's face began to bead with fresh perspiration at the thought of bulkheads enclosing him once more, but he managed to smile, and then asked hesitantly, May I wait for the shuttle out here, sir? Certainly, we'll arrange for that. Well, goodbye, Mr. Holliday. Goodbye, Mr. Marlowe. Goodbye, Mr. Broussard. And goodbye, Mr. Meade. I don't suppose you'll be seeing me again. Good luck, Mr. Holliday, Meade said. Marlowe twisted awkwardly in the car's back seat, wiping futilely at the long smear of chocolate on his trouser pocket. Well, he thought, at least he'd given the old man his name on the star maps until Earthmen stopped roving. At least he'd given him that. Meade was looking at him. I don't suppose we've got time to let him die in peace, have we? He asked. Martel shook his head. I suppose we'll have to start breaking him immediately, won't we? Marlowe nodded. I'll get at it right away, sir. Dave, does everybody have to hate me? Can't anyone understand? Even you, Creed, even you, me. Daily-shoed Claven, stooped and withered, sat hopelessly opposite Marlowe, who sat behind his desk like a grizzled polar bear, his thinning mane of white hair unkempt and straggling. Marlowe, my people are strangling, the old Dovenalid said. Marlowe looked at him silently. The Holiday Republic has signed treaty after treaty with us, and still their citizens raid our mining planets, driving away our own people, stealing the resources we must have if we are to live. Martel sighed. There's nothing I can do. We have gone to the Holiday government repeatedly, Good Claven pleaded. They tell us the raiders are criminals, that they're doing their best to stop them, but they still buy the metal the raiders bring them. They have to, Martel said. There are no available resources anywhere within practicable distances. If they're to have any civilization at all, they've got to buy from the outlaws. But they are members of the Union, but Claven protested. Why don't you do anything to stop them? We can't, Martel said again. They're members of the Union, yes, but they're also a free republic. We have no administrative jurisdiction over them, and if we attempted to establish one, our citizens would rise in protest all over our territory. Then we're finished. Dovenel is a dead world. Martel nodded slowly. I'm very sorry. If there's anything I can do, or that the Ministry can do, we will do it, but we cannot save the Dovenalid state. Bud Claven looked at him bitterly. Thank you, he said. Thank you for your generous offer of a gracious funeral. I don't understand you, he burst out suddenly. I don't understand you people. Diplomatic lies, yes. Expediency, yes. But this madness, this fanatical, illogical devotion of the state in the cause of the people who will tolerate no state, this I cannot understand. Martel looked at him, his eyes full of tears. Hood Claven, he said, you are quite right. We are a race of maniacs, and that is why Earthmen rule the galaxy. For our treaties are not binding, and our promises are worthless. Our government does not represent our people. It represents our people as they once were. The delay in the democratic process is such that the treaty signed today fulfills the promise of yesterday. But today, the body politics has formed a new opinion, is following a new logic, which is completely at variance with that of yesterday. And Earthman's promise, expressed in words or deeds, is good only at the instant he makes it. A second later, new factors have entered into the old circumstances, and a new chain of logic is formed in his head, to be altered again a few seconds later. He thought suddenly of that poor, claustrophobic devil Holiday, harried from planet to planet, never given a moment's rest, and civilizing, spreading the race of humankind wherever he was driven. Civilizing with a fervor no hired dummy could have accomplished, driven by his fear to sell with all the real estate agent's talent that had been born in him, selling for the sake of money with which to buy that land he needed for his peace, and always being forced to sell a little too much. Bud Claven rose from his chair. You are also right, Martel. You are a race of maniacs, gibbering across the stars. Oh, that the other races of the universe hate you. Marlowe, with a tremendous effort, heaved himself out of his chair. Hate us? He lumbered around the desk and advanced on the frightened Dovenalid, who was retreating backwards before his path. Can't you see it? Don't you understand that if we are to pursue any course of action over a long time, if we are ever going to achieve a galaxy in which an Earthman can someday live in peace with himself, we must each day violate all the moral codes and creeds which we held inviolate the day before. That we must fight against every ideal, every principle which our fathers taught us, because they no longer apply to our new logic. You hate us. He thrust his fat hand, his nails bitten down to the quick and beyond, in front of the cringing alien's eyes. You poor, weak, single-minded, ineffective actual thing. We hate ourselves. Disowned by Victor Endersby. The sky sagged downward, bellying blackly with a sudden summer rain, giving me a vision of catching my train in sodden clothing after the short cut across the fields, which I was taking in company with my brother Tristan and his fiancée. The sullen atmosphere ripped apart with an electric glare. Our ears quivered to the throbbing sky, while huge drops, jarred loose from the air by the thunder impact, splattered sluggishly, heavily about us. Little breezes swept out from the storm center, lifting the undersides of the long grass leaves to view in waves of lighter green. I complained peevishly. "Ah, mop up," said Tristan. "You've plenty of time, and there's a big oak. It's as dry under there as a cave." "I think that'll be fun," twittered Alice, "to wait out a thunderstorm under a tree." "Under a tree," I said, hardly, not anchoring to furnish myself as an exhibit on the physiological effects of a lightning stroke. "No, sir." "Rats," said Tristan. "Oh, that's a fairy tale. Trees being dangerous in a thunderstorm." The rain now beat through our thin summer clothing as Tristan seized Alice's hand and towed her toward the spreading shelter. I followed them at first, then began to lag with an odd unwillingness. I had been only half serious in my objection, but all at once that tree exercised an odd repulsion on me. An imaginary picture of the electric fluid coursing through my shriveling nerve channels grew unpleasantly vivid. Suddenly I knew I was not going under the tree. I stopped dead, pulling my hat brim down behind to divert the rivulet coursing down the back of my neck, calling to the others in a voice rather cracked from embarrassment. They looked at me curiously, and Alice began to twit me, standing in the rain, while Tristan desired to know whether we thought we were a pair of goldfish. In his estimation, we might belong to the pristine tribe all right, but not to that decorative branch thereof. To be frank, he used the term suckers. Feeling exceptionally foolish, I planted myself doggedly in the soaking grass as Alice turned to dash for the tree. Then the thing happened, the thing which to this hour makes the fabric of space with its unknown forces seem an insecure and eerie garment for the body of man. Over the slight rise beyond the tree, as the air crackled, roared and shook under the thunder blasts, there appeared an object moving in long, leisurely bounds, drifting before the wind, and touching the ground lightly each time. It was about 18 inches in diameter, globular, glowing with coruscating fires, red, green, and yellow, a thing of unearthly and wholly sinister beauty. Alice poised with one foot half raised and shrieked at Tristan, half terrified, half elated at the sight. He wheeled quickly there under the tree and slowly backed away as the thing drifted in to keep him company in his shelter. We could not see his face, but there was a stiffness to his figure indicating something like fear. Suddenly, things I had read rose into my memory. This was one of those objects variously called fireballs, globe lightning, meteors, and the like. I also recalled the deadly explosive potency said to be sometimes possessed by such entities, and called out frantically, "Tristan, don't touch it. Get away quickly, but don't disturb the air." He heard me, and as the object wavered about in the comparative calm under the tree, drifting closer to him, started to obey. But it suddenly approached his face, and seized with a reckless terror, he snatched off his hat and batted at it as one would at a pestilent bee. Instantly there was a blinding glare, a stunning detonation, and a violent air wave which threw me clear off my feet and onto the ground. I sat up blindly with my vision full of opalescent lights and my ears ringing, unable to hear, see, or think. Slowly my senses came back. I saw Alice struggling upright in the grass before me. She cast a quick glance toward the tree, then, still on her knees, covered her face and shuddered. For a long time, it seemed, I gazed toward the tree without sight conveying any aside from my dazed state, the thing was too bizarre. It gave no foothold to experience for the erection of understanding. My brother's body lay, or hung, or rested. What term could describe it? With his stomach across the underside of a large limb, a few feet above where he had stood. He was doubled up like a hairpin, his abdomen pressed tightly up against this bough, and his arms, legs, and head extended stiffly, straightly, skyward. Getting my scattered faculties and discordant limbs together, I made my way to the tree, the gruesome thought entering my mind that Tristan's body had been transfixed by some downward-pointing snag as it was blown up against the limb, and that the strange stiffness of his limbs was due to some ghastly, sudden rigor mortis brought on by electric shock. Dazed with horror and grief, I reached up to his clothing and pulled gently, braced for the shock of the falling body. It remained immovable against the bough. A harder tug brought no results either. Gathering up all my courage against the vision of the supposed snag tearing its rough length out of the poor flesh, I leaped up, grasping the body about chest and hips, and hung. It came loose at once, without any tearing resistance such as I had expected, but manifesting a strong, elastic pull upward, as though someone were pulling it with a rope. As I dropped back to the ground with it, the upward resistance remained unchanged. Nearly disorganized entirely by this phenomenon, it occurred to me that his belt where some of his clothing was still caught, and I jerked sideways to pull it loose. It did not loosen, but I found myself suddenly out from under the tree, my brother dragging upward from my arms until my toes almost left the ground. And there was obviously no connection between him and the tree, or between him and anything else but myself for that matter. At this I went weak, my arms relaxed despite my will, and an incredible fact happened. I found the body sliding skyward through my futile grasp. Desperately I caught my hands clasped together about his wrist, this last grip almost lifting me from the earth, his legs and remaining arm string fantastically skyward. Through the haze which seemed to be finally drowning my amazed and tortured soul, I knew that my fingers were slipping through one another, and that in another instant my brother would be gone. Gone where? Why? And there was a sudden shriek and the impact of a frantic body against mine as Alice, whom I'd quite forgotten, made a skyward running jump and clasped the arm frantically to her bosom with both her own. With vast relief, I loosened my cramped fingers, only to feel her silken garments begin to slide skyward against my cheek. It was more instinct than sense which made me clutch at her legs. God, had I not done that? As it was, I held both forms anchored with only a slight pull, waiting dumbly for the next move, quite non-composed by this time, I think. "Quick, Jim," she shrieked. "Quick, under the tree. I can't hold him long." Very glad indeed to be told what to do, I obeyed. Under her direction we got the body under a low limb and wedged up against it, where our feet both now on the ground, we balanced it with little effort. Feverishly, once more at her initiative, we took off our belts and strapped it firmly, whereupon we collapsed in one another's arms, shuddering beneath it. The blasé reader may consider that we here manifested the characters of sensitive weaklings, but let him undergo the like. The supernatural, or seemingly so, has always had the power to chill the hottest blood, and here was an invisible horror reaching out of the sky for its prey, without any of the ameliorating trite features which would temper an encounter with the alleged phenomena of Ghostland. For a time we sat under that fatal tree, listening to the dreary drench of rain pouring off the leaves, quivering nerve-shaken to the thunderclaps. Lacking one another, we had gone mad. It was the beginning of a mutual dependence in the face of the unprecedented, which was to grow into something greater during the bizarre days to follow. There was no need of words for each of us to know that the other was struggling frantically for a little rational light on the outer catastrophe in which we were entangled. never once occurred to us that my brother might still be alive, until a long, shuddering groan sounded above us. In combined horror and joy, we sprang up. He was twisting weakly in the belts, muttering deliriously. We unfastened him and pulled him to the ground, where I sat on his knees while she pressed down on his shoulders, and so kept him recumbent, both horrified at the insistent lift of his body under us. She kissed him frantically and stroked his cheeks, I feeling utterly without resource. He grew stronger, muttered wildly, and his eyes opened, staring upward through the tree limbs. He became silent and stiffened, gazing fixedly upward with a horror in his wild blue gaze which chilled our blood. What did he see there? What dire otherworld thing dragging him into the depths of space? Surely his eyes closed and he ceased to mutter. I took his legs under my arms. The storm was clearing now, and we set out for home with gruesomely buoyant steps, the insistent pull remaining steady. Would it increase? We gazed upward with terrified eyes, becoming calmer by degree as conditions remained unchanged. Jim, we can't take him in like this. I stopped. Why not? Oh, because it's too ridiculously awful. I don't know just how to say it. Oh, can't you see it for yourself? In a dim way, I saw it. No cultured person cares to be made a center of public interest unless on grounds of respect. To come walking in this fashion, buoyed balloon-like by the body of this loved one, and before the members of a frivolous, gaping house party, even I could imagine the mingled horror and derision, the hysterics among the women, perhaps. Nor would it stop there. Rumors, and heaven only knows what distortions such rumors might undergo, having their source in the incredible, would range our social circle like wildfire. And the newspapers, for our families are established and known, no, it wouldn't go. I tied Tristan to a stile and called up Jack Briggs, our host from a neighboring house, explained briefly that Tristan had met with an accident, asked him to say nothing, and explained where to bring the machine. In 10 minutes he had maneuvered the heavy sedan across the rough, wet fields. And then we had another problem on our hands, to let Jack into what had happened without shocking him into uselessness. It was not until we got him to test Tristan's eerie buoyancy with his own hands that we were able to make him understand the real nature of our problem. And after that, his comments remained largely gibberish for some time. He was even quicker than we were to see the need for secrecy. He had vivid visions of the political capital which opposing newspapers would make of any such occurrence at his party, and so we arranged a plan. According to which we drove to the back of the house, explained to the curious who rushed out that Tristan had been injured by a stroke of lightning, and rushed the closely wrapped form up to his room, feeling a great relief at having something solid between us and the sky. While Jack went downstairs to dismiss the party as courteously as possible, Alice and I tied my brother to the bed with trunk straps. Whereupon the bed and patient plumped lightly but decisively against the ceiling as soon as we removed our weight. While we gazed upward open-mouthed, Jack returned. His faculties were recovering better than ours, probably because his affections were not so involved, and he gave the answer at once. "Ah, hell," he said, "pull the damn bed down and spike it to the floor." This we did, then we held a short but intense consultation. Whatever else might be the matter, obviously Tristan was suffering severely from shock and, for all we knew, maybe from partial electrocution. So we called up Dr. Grosnoff in the nearest town. Grosnoff, after our brief but disingenuous explanation, threw off the bed covers in a businesslike way, then straightened up grimly. "May I ask," he said with sarcastic politeness, "since when a straitjacket has become first aid for a case of lightning stroke?" "He was delirious," I stammered. "Delirious, my eye. He's as quiet as a lamb, and you've tied him down so tightly that the straps are cutting right into him. Of all the... He stopped, evidently feeling words futile. and before we could make an effective attempt to stop him, whipped out a knife and cut the straps. Tristan's unfortunate body instantly crashed against the ceiling, smashing the lathing and plaster, and remaining half embedded in the ruins. A low cry of pain arose from Alice. Dr. Grosnoff staggered to a chair and sat down, his eyes fixed on the ceiling with a steady stare, the odd caricature of a man coolly studying an interesting phenomenon. My brother appeared to be aroused by the shock, struggling about in his embedment, and finally sat up, down I mean. Then he stood on the ceiling and began to walk. His nose had been bruised by the impact, and I noticed with uncomprehending wonder that the blood moved slowly upward over his lip. He saw the window and walked across the ceiling to it upside down. There he pushed the top of the window down and leaned out, gazing up into the sky with some sort of fascination. Instantly he crouched on the ceiling, hiding his eyes, while the house rang with shriek after shriek of mortal terror, speeding the packing of the parting guests. Alice seized my arm, her fingers cutting painfully into the flesh. "Jim," she screamed, "I see it now, don't you? His gravity's all changed around. He weighs up. He thinks the sky's under him." The human mind is so constructed that merely to name a thing oddly smooths its unwanted outlines to the grasp of the mind. The conception of a simple reversal of my brother's weight, I think, saved us all from the padded cell. That made it so commonplace, such an everyday sort of thing, likely to happen to anybody. The ordinary phenomenon of gravitation is no whit more serious, in all truth, than that which we are now witnessing, but we are born to it. Dr. Grosnoff recovered in a manner which showed considerable caliber. "Well," he grunted, "that being the case, we'd best be looking after him. Nervous shock, possible electric shock and electric burns, psychasthenia. That's going to be a long-drawn affair. Bruises, maybe a little concussion, and possibly internal injury. That was equivalent to a 10-foot unbroken fall flat on his stomach, and I'll never forgive myself if... Get me that chair." With infinite care and reassuring words, the big doctor with her help pulled my brother down, the latter frantically begging us not to let him fall again. Holding him securely on the bed and trying to reassure him, Grosnoff said, "Straps and ropes won't do. His whole weight hangs in them. They'll cut him unmercifully. Take a sheet, tie the corners with ropes, and let him lie in that like a hammock." It took many reassurances as to the strength of this arrangement before Tristan was at comparative peace. Dr. Grosnoff effected an examination by slacking off the ropes until Tristan lay a couple of feet clear of the bed, then himself lay on the mattress face up, prodding the patient over. The examination concluded, he informed us that Tristan's symptoms were simply those of a general physical shock, such as would be expected in the case of a man standing close to the center of an explosion, though from our description of the affair, he could not understand how my brother had survived at all. The glimmering of an explanation of this did not come until long afterward. So far as physical condition was concerned, Tristan might expect to recover fully in a matter of weeks. Mentally, the doctor was not so sure. The boy had gone through a terrible experience, and one which was still continuing. Might continue no one knew how long. "We were," said the doctor, "up against a trick played by the great Sphinx nature, and one which, so far as he knew, had never before taken place in the history of all mankind. There is faintly taking shape in my mind," he said, "the beginning of a theory as to how it came about. But it is a theory having many ramifications and involving much in several lines of science, with most of which I am but little acquainted. For the present, I have no more to say than that if a theory of causation can be worked out, it will be the first step toward cure. But it may be the only step. Don't build hopes." Looking Alice and me over carefully, he gave us each a nerve sedative and departed, leaving us with the feeling that there was a man of considerable wider learning than might be expected of a small-town doctor. In point of fact, we learned that this was the case. The specialist has been described as a man who knows more and more about less and less. In Dr. Grosnoff's mind, the less and less outweighed the more and more. Tristan grew stronger physically. Mentally, he was intelligent enough to help us and help himself by keeping his mind as much as possible off his condition, sometimes by sheer force of will. Meantime, Dr. Grosnoff, realizing that his patient could not be kept forever tied in bed, had assisted me in preparing for his permanent care at home. The device was simple. We had just taken his room, remodeled the ceiling as a floor, and fitted it with furniture upside down. Most of the problems involved in this were fairly simple. The matter of a bath rather stumped us for a while, until we hit upon a shower. The jets came up from under Tristan's feet, from the point of view of his perception. He told us that one of the strangest of all his experiences was to see the wastewater swirl about in the pan over his head, and being sucked up the drain as though drawn by some mysterious magnet. My brother and I shared a flat alone, so there was no servant problem to deal with, but he was going to need care as well as companionship, and I had to earn my living. For Alice, it was a case where the voice of the heart chimed with that of necessity, and I was best man at perhaps the weirdest marriage ceremony which ever took place on this earth. Held down in bed with a roped sheet, all betraying signs carefully concealed, Tristan was married to Alice by an unsuspecting dominie who took it all for one of those ordinary, though romantic, sick-bed affairs. From the first, Tristan felt better and more secure in his special quarters, and was now able to move about quite freely within his limits, though such were his mental reactions that for his comfort we had to refinish the floor to look like plaster ceiling, to eliminate as far as possible the upside-down suggestions left in the room, and to keep the windows closely shaded. I soon found that the sight of me, or anyone else, walking upside down to him was very painful. Only in the case of Alice did other considerations remove the unpleasantness. Little by little, the accumulation of experience brought to my mind the full and vivid horror of what the poor lad had suffered and was suffering. Why, when he had looked out of that window into the sky, he was looking down into a bottomless abyss, from which he was sustained only by the frail plaster and planking under his feet. The whole earth, with its trees and buildings, was suspended over his head, seemingly about to fall at any moment with him into the depths. The sun at noon glared upward from the depths of an inferno, lighting from below the somber earth suspended overhead. Thus the warm comfort of the sun, which has cheered the heart of man from time immemorial, now took on an unearthly, unnatural semblance. I learned that he could never quite shake off the feeling that the houses were anchored into the earth, suspended only by the embedment of their foundations in the soil, that trees were suspended from their roots, which groaned with a strain, that soil was held to the bedrock only by its cohesion. He even dreaded lest, during storms, the grip of the muddy soil be loosened, and the fields fall into the blue. It was only when clasped tight in Alice's arms that the horrors wholly left him. All the reasoning we might use on his mind, or that he himself could bring to bear on it, was useless. We found that the sense of up and down is ineradicably fixed by the balancing apparatus of the body. Meanwhile, his psychology was undergoing strange alterations. The more I came to appreciate the actual conditions he was living under, the more apparent it seemed to me that he must have a cast-iron mental stamina to maintain sanity at all. But he not only did that, he began to recover normal strength, and to be hurt unbearably by his constant confinement. So it came about that he began to venture a little at time to time from his room, wandering about on the ceiling of the rest of the house. However, he could not yet look out of windows, but sidled up to them with averted face to draw any blinds As he grew increasingly restless, we all felt more and more that the thing could not continue as it was. Some way out must be found. We had many a talk with Grosnoff, at last inducing him to speak about this still half-formed theory which he had dimly conceived at the first. For many decades, he said, there have been a few who regarded the close analogies between magnetism and gravitational action as symptomatic of a concealed identity between them. Einstein's field theory practically proves it on the mathematical side. Now it is obvious that if gravitation is a form of magnetism, and if so, it belongs to another plane of magnetic forces than that which we know and use, then the objects on a planet must have the opposite polarity from that of the planet itself. Since the globe is itself a magnet, with a positive and negative pole, its attraction power is not that of a magnet on any plane, because then the human race would be divided into two species, each polarized in the opposite to its own pole. When an individual of either race reached the equator, he would become weightless, and when he crossed it, would be repelled into space. Lord, I said, there would be a plot for one of your science fiction writers. I can present you with another, said Dr. Grosnoff. How do we know whether another planet would have the opposite sign to our own bodies? Well, I chuckled, they'll find that out soon enough when the first interplanetary expedition tries to land on one of them. Grunted the medico. That'll be the least of their troubles. But you said the polarity couldn't be that of a magnet, then what? Don't you remember the common pith ball of your high school physics days? An accumulation of positive electricity repels an accumulation of the negative, if indeed we can correctly use accumulation for negativity, and it is my idea that the Earth is the container of a gigantic accumulation of this meta, or hyperelectricity, which we are postulating, and our bodies contain a charge of the opposite sign. But doctor, the retention of a charge of static electricity by a body in the presence of one of the opposite sign requires insulation of the containing bodies. For instance, lightning is a breaking down of the air insulation between the ground and a cloud. In our case, we are constantly in contact with the Earth, and the charges would equalize. Please bear in mind, Jim, that we are not talking about electricity as now handled by man, but about some form of it yet hypothetical. We don't know what kind of insulation it would require. We may be constitutionally insulated. And you think the fireball broke down that insulation by the shock deterrent system? I asked. The logic of the thing was shaping up hazily, but unmistakably. But then, why don't we frequently see people kiting off the Earth as the result of explosions? How do you know they haven't? Don't we have plenty of mysterious disappearances as the result of explosions, and particularly strangely large numbers of missing in a major war? My blood chilled. The world was beginning to seem a pretty awful place. Grosnoff saw my disturbance and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I'm afraid, he said, smiling, that I rather yielded to the temptation to get a rise out of you. That suggestion might be unpleasantly true under special circumstances, but I particularly have an eye out for the special capacities of that weird and rare phenomenon, the fireball. It isn't impossible that the energy of the fireball went into the repolarization rather than into a destructive concussion, hence Tristan's escape. You mean its effect is quantitatively different from that of any other explosion? It may be so. It is known to be an electric conglomeration of some kind, but that's all. Meantime, circumstances weren't going well with us. The financial burden of Tristan's support, added to the strain of the situation, was becoming overwhelming. Tristan knew this and felt it keenly. This brought him to a momentous decision. He looked down at us from the ceiling one day with an expression of unusual tenseness, and announced that he was going out permanently and to take part in the world again. I've gotten now so I can bear to look out the windows quite well. It's only a matter of time and practice until I can stand in the open, After all, it isn't any worse than being a steel worker or a steeplejack. Even if the worst came to the worst, I'd rather be burst open by the frozen vacuum of interstellar space than to splash upon a sidewalk before an admiring populace, and people do that every day. Dr. Grosnoff, who was present, expressed great delight. His patient was coming along well mentally at least. Alice sat down trembling. "But good Lord, Tristan," I said, "what possible occupation could you follow?" "Oh, I've brooded over that for weeks, and I've come across the Rubicon. I think we're a long way past such petty things as personal pride. Did it ever occur to you that what from one point of view is a monstrous catastrophe, from another is an asset?" "What in the dickens are you talking about?" I asked. "I'm talking about the, he gulped painfully, "the stage." Alice wrung her hands, crying bitterly. "Wonderful, splendid, Tristan Leuber, the world's unparalleled upside-down man. He doesn't know whether he's on his head or his heels. He's always up in the air about something. But you can't upset him. Vaudeville tonight. The Botongo brothers, brilliant Bernese balancers. Orshigani, the prima donna of sealdom. And Tristan Leuber, the balloon man. He uses an anchor for a parachute. And last, indeed, the Leuber family will have arrived sensationally in the public eye. There are," Alice raved, 2 billion people on the earth today, counting 3 generations per century. There have been about 12 billion of us in the last 200 years, and out of all those, and all the millions and billions before that, we had to be picked for this loathsome cosmic joke. Just little us, for all that distinction. If our romance had to be spoiled by a tragedy smeared across the billboards of notoriety, why couldn't it have been in some decent human sort of way? Why this ghastly absurdity? "From time immemorial," said Grosnoff, "there have been men who sought to excite the admiration of their fellows, to get themselves worshipped, to dominate, to collect perquisites, by developing some wonderful personal power or another. From Icarus on down, levitation or its equivalent has been a favorite. The ecstatics of medieval times, the Hindu yogis, even the daydreaming schoolboy, have had visions of floating in air before the astounding multitudes by a mere act of will. The frequency of flying dreams may indicate such a thing as a possibility in nature. Tradition says many have accomplished it. If so, it was by a reversal of polarity through an act of will. Those who did it, yogis, believed in successive lives on Earth. If they were right about the one, why not the other? Suppose one who had developed that power of will carried it to another birth, where it lay dormant in the subconscious until set off uncontrolled by some special shock. Alice paled. Then Tristan might have been. He might. Then again, maybe my brain is addled by this thing. In any case, the moral is, don't monkey with nature. She's particular. Tristan's vaudeville scheme was not as easily realized as said. The first manager to whom we applied was stubbornly skeptical in spite of Tristan's appearance standing upside down in stilts heavily weighted at the ground ends, and even after his resistance was broken down in a manner which left him gasping and a little woozy, began to reason unfavorably in a hard-headed way. Audiences, he explained, were off levitation acts. Too old. No matter what you did, they'd lay it to concealed wires and yawn. Even if you called a committee from the audience, the committee itself would merely be sore at not being able to solve the trick. The audience would consider the committee a fake or merely dumb. And all that would take too much time for an act of that kind. Oh yeah, I know, it's got me going all right, but I can't think like me about this sort of thing. I got to think like the audience does, or go out of business. After which solid but unprofitable lesson in psychology, we dropped the last vestige of pride and tried a circus sideshow, but the results were similar. Nah, the Rubes don't wear celluloid collars anymore. You can't slip wire tricks over on 'em. But he can do this in a big topless tent. or even out in an open field if you like. Nope, steel rods run up the metal of a rope has been done before. Steel rods on a rope which the people see uncoiled from the ground in front of their eyes. Well, they'd think of something else then. I'm telling you, it won't go. Sure, people like to be fooled, but they want it to be done right. Yes, I sneered, and a hell of a lot of people have fooled themselves right about this matter too. He looked at me curiously. Say, have you really got something up your sleeve? You'd be surprised. Thus he grudgingly gave us a chance for a tryout, and he was surprised indeed. But on thinking it over, he decided like the vaudeville man. Listen, Tristan said suddenly in a voice of desperation. I'll do a parachute drop into the sky and land on an airplane. Tristan, shrieked Alice in horror. The circus man nearly lost his cigar, then bit it in two. Say, what the? I'll call it right now. I'll get you the plane and shoot if you'll put up a deposit to cover the cost. If you do that, we'll have the best money in the tents. If you don't, I keep the money. If I don't, said Tristan distinctly, I'll have not the slightest need for the money. But the airplane idea was out. We could think of no way for him to make the landing on such a swiftly moving vehicle. Again, Alice solved it. If you absolutely must break my heart and put me in a sanitarium, she sobbed, get a blimp. Of course, and that's what we did, on the first attempt coming unpleasantly close to doing just that to Alice. The blimp captain was obviously skeptical and betrayed signs of a peeve at having his machine hired for a hoax, but money was money, and he agreed to obey our instructions meticulously. His tone was perfunctory, however, despite my desperate attempts to impress him with the seriousness of the matter, and that nonchalance of his came near to having dire consequences. The captain was supplied with a sort of boat hook with instructions to steer his course to reach the parachute ropes as it passed him on its upward flight, and he was seriously warned of the fact that, after the chute reached 2,000 or 3,000 feet, its speed would increase because of the rarefaction of the air, and in case of a miss, it would become constantly harder to overtake. These directions he received with a scornful half-smile. Obviously, he never expected to see the chute open. We got all set, the blimp circling overhead, Tristan upside down in his seat suspended skyward, a desperately grim look on his face, and Alice almost in collapse. We were all spared the agony of several hundred feet of unbroken fall. The chute was open on the ground and rose at a leisurely speed, but too fast at that for the comfort of any of us. I don't think the wondering crowd and the dumbfounded circus people ever saw a stranger sight than that chute drifting upward into the blue. We heard nothing of hidden wires, then or ever after. The white circle grew pitifully small and forlorn against the fathomless azure, and suddenly we noticed that the blimp seemed to be merely drifting with the wind, making no attempt to get under or over Tristan. Our hearts labored painfully. Had the engines broken down? Alice buried her face against my sleeve with a moan. I can't look. Tell me. I tried to, in a voice which I vainly tried to make steady. All at once, the blimp went into frenzied activity. We learned afterwards that his crew of 3, the captain included, had been so completely paralyzed by the reality of the event that they had forgotten what they were there for until almost too late. Now we heard the high note of its overdriven engines as it rolled and rocked toward the rising chute. For a moment the white spot showed against its side, then tossed and pitched wildly in the wake of the propellers as driven too hastily and frenziedly, the ship overshot its mark and the captain missed his grab. I could only squeeze Alice tightly and choke as the aerial objects parted company and the blue gap between them widened. Instantly, avid to retrieve his mistake, the captain swung his craft in a wild careen around and a spiral upward. But he tried to do too many things at a time, make too much altitude and headway both at once. The blimp pitched deeply upward to a standstill, barely moving toward the parachute. Quickly it sloped downward again and gathered speed, nearing the chute, and then making a desperate zoom upward on its momentum. Mistake number 3. He had waited too long before using his elevator, and the chute fled hopelessly away just ahead of the up-tilted nose of the blimp. I could only moan, and Alice made no sound or movement. Next we saw the blimp's water ballast streaming earthward in the sun, and it was put into a long, steady spiral in pursuit of the parachute, whose speed, or so it seemed to my agonized gaze, was now noticeably on the increase. The altitude seemed appallingly great. The blimp's ceiling, I knew, was only about 20,000, and my brother, even if not frozen to death by that time, would be traveling far faster then than any climbing speed the blimp could make. As his fall increased in speed, the climb of the back decreased. At last, with a quiver of renewed hope, I saw the blimp narrowing down its spirals. It was overtaking. Smaller and smaller grew both objects, but so did the gap between them. At last they merged, the tiny white dot and the little gray minnow. In one long agony, I waited to see whether the gap would open out again. Lord of hosts, the blimp was slanting steeply downward. The parachute had vanished. Then at last I paid some attention to the totally limp form in my arms, and a few minutes later, amid an insane crowd, a pitiful, embarrassed, and nerve-shaking dirigible navigator was helping me lift my heavily wrapped, shivering brother from the gondola, while the mechanics turned their attention to the over-driven engines and racked framing. Did I say, helping me lift? Such is the force of habit, but verily, a new nomenclature would have to come into being to deal adequately with such a life as my poor brother's. Tristan seized my hand. "Jim," he said through chattering teeth, "I'm cured. End of the awful fear. The second time he missed, I just gave up entirely. I didn't care any longer. And then somehow I felt such a sense of peace and freedom. There weren't any upside-down things around to torture me, no sense of insecurity. I just was in a great blue quiet. It wasn't like falling at all. No awful shock to meet, no sickness or pain, just quietly floating along from here to there, with no particular dividing line between anywhere. The cold hurt, of course, but somehow it didn't seem to matter, and was getting better when they got me. But now I can do things you never even imagined." Thus began my brother's real public career. It arrived. After that, he was able to name his own compensation, and shortly during his tours, began to sport a private dirigible of his own, which he often used for jumps between stands. He told me jokingly that it was very fitting transportation for him, as his 160-pound lift saved quite a bit of expense for helium. He developed an astonishing set of tricks. After the jump, he would arrive on the field suspended above the dirigible, doing trapeze tricks. After that, in the show tent, he would go through some more of them, with a few hair raisers of his own invention, one of which consisted of apparently letting go the rope by accident and shooting skyward with a wild shriek, only to be caught at the end of a fine, especially woven piano wire attached to a spring safety belt, the cable being in turn fastened to the end of the rope. Needless to say, Alice was unable to wax enthusiastic about any of these feats, though she loyally accompanied him in his travels. She would sit in the tent gazing at him with horrible fascination, and month by month grew thinner and more strained. Tristan felt her stress deeply, but was making money so fast that we all felt that in a short time, if not able to finance the recovery of a cure, at least he could retire and live a safer life. And he found his ideal haven of rest in a Pennsylvania coal mine. Thus, the project grew in his mind of buying an abandoned mine and fitting it with comfortable and spacious inverted quarters, environed with fungus gardens, air ferns, and the like, plants which could be trained to grow upside down, he emerging only for necessary sunbaths. As time went on, I really grew accustomed to the situation, though seeing less and less of Tristan and Alice. During summers they were on tour, and in winter were quartered in Tristan's coal mine, which had become a reality. One summer day when the circus stopped at a small town where I was taking vacation, I was overjoyed at the opportunity to see them. I timed myself to get there as the afternoon performance was over, but arrived a little early and went on into the untopped tent. Tristan waved an inverted greeting at me from his poise on his trapeze, and I watched for a few minutes. There was an odd mood about the crowd that day, largely due to a group of loud-mouthed hillbillies from the back country, the sort of which is so ignorant as to live in perpetual fear of getting something slipped over, and so believes everything it is told, looking for something ulterior behind every exterior. Having duly exposed to their own satisfaction the strong man's wooden dumbbells, the snake charmer's rubber serpents, the fat woman's pillows, and the bearded lady's false whiskers, I don't know what they did about the living skeleton. These fellows were now gaping before Tristan's platform, and growing hostile as their rather inadequate brains failed to cook up any damaging explanation. Yeah, yelled the long-necked, flat-bearded youth suddenly. He's got an iron bar in that rope. They had come too late to see the parachute drop. Tristan grinned and pulled himself down the rope, which of course fell limp behind him. At this, the crowd cheered and booed to the hasty youth, who became so resentfully abusive of Tristan that one of the attendants pushed him out of the tent. As he passed me, I caught fragments of wrathy words. Wished I'd had a, show him whether it's a fake. Tristan closed his act by dropping full length to the end of his invisible wire, then pulled himself down, got into his stilts, and was unfastening the belt when the manager rushed in with a request that he repeat for the benefit of a special party just arrived on a delayed train. Go on and look at the animals, old man, Tristan called to me. I'll be with you in about half an hour. I strolled out idly, meeting on the way the flat-bearded youth, who seemed bent on making his way back into the tent, wearing a mingled air of furtiveness, of triumph, and anticipation. Wondering casually just what kind of fool the lad was planning to make of himself next, I wandered on toward the main entrance, only to be stopped by an appalling uproar behind me. There was a raucous, gurgling shriek of mortal terror, the loud composite "ooh" of a shocked or astonished crowd, a set of fervent curses directed at someone, loud confused babbling, and then a woman's voice raised in a seemingly endless succession of hysterical shrieks. Thinking that an animal had gotten loose or something of that kind, I wheeled. Unmistakably, the racket came from Tristan's own tent. Cold dread clutching at my heart, and with lead on my boot soles, I rushed frantically back. At the entrance, I was held by a mad onrush of humanity for some moments. When I reached the platform, Tristan was not in sight. Then I noticed the long-necked boy sitting on the platform with his face in his hands, shrieking. I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to. Damn it, don't touch me. I thought sure it was fake. I saw a new, glittering jackknife lying on the platform beside the limp, foot-long stub of Tristan's rope. Slowly, frozenly, I raised my eyes. The blue abyss was traceless of any object. The Outbreak of Peace by H.B. Fife. When properly conducted, a diplomatic mission can turn the most smashing of battle successes into a fabulous Pyrrhic victory. It was a great pity, Space Marshal Wilbur Hennings reflected as he gazed through the one-way glass of the balcony door, that the local citizens had insisted upon decorating the square before their capital with the hulk of the first spaceship ever to have landed on Pollux 5. 150 years probably seemed impressive to them, amid the explosive spread of Terran colonies and federations. Actually, in the Marshal's opinion, it was merely long enough to reveal such symbols as more than antiquated but less than historically precious. I presume you have a plan to have me march past that heap, he complained, tugging at the extremely historical sword that completed the effect. white and gold uniform. Commodore Miller, his aide, stiffened nervously. "Around to the right of it, sir," he gestured. "As you see, the local military are already keeping the route clear of onlookers. We thought it would be most impressive if your party were to descend the outer stairway from the palace balcony here to heighten the importance of, to draw out the pomp and circumstance of opening the comforts. Well, sir, and then across the square to the conference hall of the capital, outside which you'll pause for a few gracious words to the crowd. And that will probably be my last opportunity to enjoy the morning sunlight. Oh well, it seems much too bright here in any case." The Commodore absently reached out to adjust a fold in his chief's sky blue sash, and the Marshal as absently parried the gesture. "I shall be hardly less than half an hour crossing the square," he predicted sourly. "With the cheering thrones they have undoubtedly arranged, and the sunlight reflecting from all that imitation marble, it will be no place to collect one's thoughts." He turned back to the huge chamber constituting the office of the suite supplied him by his Peluxian hosts. The skeleton staff of men and women remaining occupied chairs and benches along only one wall, since the bulk of the delegation had been sent out to make themselves popular with the local populace. Hennings presumed the bulk of the local populace to be consisted of Peluxians, assigned to making themselves popular with this Ursan Federation delegation. His people would be listening politely to myriad reasons why the Peluxians had a natural right to occupy all the star systems from here to Castor, a dozen light years farther from Terra. No one would mention the true motive, their illogical choice in naming themselves the Twin Empire. "Now," he said crisply, once more over the main points of the situation. "No, Commodore, not the schedule of experts that will accompany me to the table. I rely upon you to have perfected that. But have there been any unforeseen developments in the actual fighting?" A cluster of aides, mostly in uniform but including a few in discreetly elegant civilian attire, moved forward. Each one was somehow followed within arm's reach by an aide of his own, so that the advance presented overtones of a small sortie. Hennings first nodded to the first, a youngish man whose air suggested technical competence more than the assurance of great authority. The officer placed his briefcase upon the glistening surface of a large table and touched a switch on the flap. "It's as well to be sure, sir," the Commodore approved. "Our men have been unable to detect any devices, but the walls may have errors." "They won't scan through this scrambler, sir," asserted the young officer. Hennings accepted a seat at the table and looked up to one of the others. "My really star," an older officer reported briskly. "The same situation prevails, with both sides having landed surface troops in force upon Myreli 2, Myreli 3, and Myreli 5, the fourth planet being inhabited by a partly civilized, non-human race protected under the Terran Convention. Recent engagements? No, sir. Maneuvering continues, but actual encounters have declined in frequency. Casualties are modest and evenly matched. General Nielsen on Myreli 3 continues to receive Peluxian agents seeking his defection." "I never thought to ask," murmured Hennings. "Is he really a distant connection of the Peluxian Nielsen family?" "It is improbable, sir, but they are polite enough to accept the pretense. Of course, he rejects every offer in a very high-minded manner, and seems to be making an adequate impression of chivalry." He stepped back at Hennings' nod to be replaced by another officer. "One minor space skirmish in the Yakoki system to report, sir. The admiral in command appears to have recouped after the error of 2 days ago, when that Peluxian detachment was so badly mauled. He arranged the capture of 3 of our cruisers." "Was that not a trifle rash?" demanded Hennings. "Intelligence is inclined to think not, sir. The ships were armed only with weapons listed as general knowledge items. The crews were not only trained in prisoner-of-war tactics, but also well supplied with small luxuries. The Biloxian fleet in that system is known to have been in space for several months, so a friendly effect is anticipated. Hennings considered the condensed report proffered for his perusal. He noted that the Biloxians had been quite gentlemanly about notifying Ursun headquarters of the capture and of the complete lack of casualties. He also saw that while the message was ostensibly directed to the Federation flagship, it had been beamed in such a fashion as to be conveniently intercepted by the secret Ursun Federation headquarters on Agogi 7. "That was a bit rude of them," he commented. "We have never dragged their secrets into the open." "On the other hand, sir," the Commodore suggested, "it may be an almost sophisticated method of permitting us to enjoy our superior finesse." "I am just as pleased to have the reminder," said Hennings. "It will serve to alert us all the more when we sit down with them over there." An elegant civilian, a large man with patient, drooping features, stated that nothing had occurred to change the economic situation. Another reported that unofficial channels of information were holding up as well as could be expected. A uniformed officer summarized the battle situation in 2 more star systems. "Those are positions we actually desire to hold, are they not?" Hennings asked. "Is action to be taken there?" "Plans call for local civilian riots at the height of the conference, sir. But can we lay no groundwork sooner than that? Sometime in the foreseeable future, at least. Take it up with propaganda. Blauvelt. It seems to me that the briefing mentioned an indigenous race on one of these planets." Blauvelt dropped his eyes momentarily, equivalent in that gathering to a blush of intense embarrassment. Hennings coughed apologetically. "Well now, I should not pry into arrangements I must later be able to deny convincingly with a clear conscience. I can only plead, my dear Blauvelt, the tenseness of the past several days." The officer murmured inaudibly, fumbled with his papers, and edged to the rear rank. Someone, at Commodore Miller's fluttering, obtained a vacuum jug of ice water and a glass for the marshal, but Hennings chose instead to produce a long cigar from a pocket concealed beneath his resplendent collection of medals. "My apologies to all of you," he said thoughtfully. "I fear that any of you who may expect contact with the local population had better see Dr. Ibn Talal about the hypnosis necessary to counteract my little indiscretion. And now, what remains?" "Nothing but the prisoner exchange, sir," Commodore Miller announced after collecting the eyes of the principal officers. Hennings got his cigar going. He listened to confirmation of a previous report that that massive exchange of sick and wounded prisoners had been accomplished, and learned that the Ursuns now suspected that they had accepted unknowingly about as many secret agents as they had sent the Biloxians. "Oh well," he sighed, "as long as the amenities were preserved. We must be as friendly as possible about that sort of thing, or run the risk of antagonizing them." Seeing that the Commodore was tense with impatience, the Marshal rose to his feet. An aide deftly received the cigar for disposal, and the party drifted expectantly toward the balcony doors. From among that part of the staff which would remain to man headquarters, an officer was dispatched to alert the Biloxian honor guard. "One more touch before the die is cast," thought the Marshal, as 2 young officers opened the balcony doors to admit the blare of trumpets. Cheers rolled successively across the square, rising like distant waves from somewhere beneath the gigantic banner that draped the Capitol opposite with fiery letters spelling out Peace Conference. With a dramatic gesture, Hennings held up the sheaf of reports they had just reviewed. Smiles disappeared in response to his own serious mien. "So much for the hostiles," he snapped. He tossed the reports to the officer who would remain in charge. Now for the actual war. Pivoting on his heel, he led them smartly out to the ornate balcony stairway that curved down into the sea of cheering Biloxians. End of section 12. A World by the Tail. This is about the best hated author on Earth, who was necessarily pampered and petted because of his crime against humanity. Exactly 3 minutes after the galactic left the New York apartment of Professor John Hamish McLeod, Ph.D., SCD, a squad of UBI men pushed their way into it. McLeod heard the door chime, opened the door, and had to back up as 8 men crowded in. The one in the lead flashed a fancily engraved ID card and said, "Union Bureau of Investigation, you're Professor McLeod." It was a statement, not a question. "No," McLeod said flatly, "I am not. I've never heard of such a name." He waited while the UBI man blinked once, then added, "If you're looking for Professor McLeod, I'm he." It always irritated him when people mispronounced his name, and in this case there was no excuse for it. "All right, Professor McLeod," said the UBI agent, pronouncing it properly this time. "However you want it. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" McLeod stared at him for half a second. 8 men, all of them under 35, in top physical condition. He was 15 years older and the oldest, and had confined his exercise, in the words of Chauncey Depew, to acting as a pallbearer for my friends who take exercise. Not that he was really in poor shape, but he certainly couldn't have argued with 8 men like these. "Come in," he said calmly, waving them into the apartment. 6 of them entered, the other 2 stayed outside in the hall. 5 of the 6 remained standing. The leader took the chair that McLeod offered him. "What are your questions, Mr. Jackson?" McLeod asked. Jackson looked very slightly surprised, as if he were not used to having people read the name on his card during the short time he allowed them to see it. The expression vanished almost instantaneously. "Professor," he said, "we'd like to know what subject you discussed with the galactic who just left." McLeod allowed himself to relax back in his chair. "Let me ask you 2 questions, Mr. Jackson. 1. What the hell business is it of yours? 2. Why do you ask me when you already know?" Again, there was only a flicker of expression over Jackson's face. "Professor McLeod, we are concerned about the welfare of the human race. Your, cooperation is requested." "You don't have to come barging in here with an armed squad just to ask my cooperation," McLeod said. "What do you want to know?" Jackson took a notebook out of his jacket pocket. "We'll just get a few facts straight first, Professor," he said, leafing through the notebook. "You were first approached by a galactic 4 years ago, on January 12, 1990. Is that right?" McLeod, who had taken a cigarette from his pack and started to light it, stopped suddenly and looked at Jackson as though the UBI man were a 2-headed embryo. "Yes, Mr. Jackson, that is right," he said slowly, as though he were speaking to a low-grade moron. "And the capital of California is Sacramento. Are there any further matters of public knowledge you would like to ask me about? Would you like to know when the War of 1812 started, or who was buried in Grant's tomb?" Jackson's jaw muscles tightened, then relaxed. "There's no need to get sarcastic, Professor. Just answer the questions." He looked back at the notebook. "According to the record, you, as a zoologist, were asked to accompany a shipment of animals to a planet named, Galactin. You did so. You returned after 18 months. Is that correct?" "To the best of my knowledge, yes," McLeod said, with heavy, biting sarcasm. "And the date of the Norman conquest was AD 1066. Jackson balled his fist suddenly and closed his eyes. "McLeod, stop it." He was obviously holding himself under rigorous restraint. He opened his eyes. "There are reasons for asking these questions, Professor. Very good reasons. Will you let me finish?" McLeod had finished lighting his cigarette. He snapped his lighter off and replaced it in his pocket. "Perhaps," he said mildly. "May I make a statement first?" Jackson took a deep breath, held it for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "Go ahead." "Thank you." There was no sarcasm in McLeod's voice now, only patience. "First, for the record, I'll say that I consider it impertinent of you to come in here demanding information without explanation. No, Jackson, don't say anything. You said I could make a statement. Thank you. Second, I will state that I'm perfectly aware of why the questions are being asked. No reaction, Mr. Jackson. You don't believe that? Very well, let me continue. On January 12, 1990, I was offered a job by certain citizens of the galactic civilization. These citizens of the galactic civilization wanted to take a shipload of terrestrial animals to their own planet, Galakian. They knew almost nothing about the care and feeding of terrestrial animals. They needed an expert. They should have taken a real expert, one of the men from the Bronx Zoo, for instance. They didn't. They requested a zoologist. Because the request was made here in America, I was the one who was picked. Any one of 7 other men could have handled the job, but I was picked. So I went, thus becoming the first Earthman ever to leave the solar system. I took care of the animals. I taught the galactics who were with me to handle and feed them. I did what I was paid to do, and it was a hard job. None of them knew anything about the care and feeding of elephants, horses, giraffes, cats, dogs, eagles, or any one of the other 100 of terrestrial life forms that went aboard that ship. All of this was done with the express permission of the Terrestrial Union government. I was returned to Earth on July 17, 1991. I was immediately taken to UBI headquarters and subjected to rigorous questioning. Then I was subjected to further questioning while connected to a polyelectroencephalograph. Then I was subjected to hearing the same questions over and again while under the influence of various drugs, in sequence and in combination. The consensus at that time was that I was not lying, nor had I been subjected to what is commonly known as brainwashing. My memories were accurate and complete. I did not know then, nor do I know now, the location of the planet Galactican. This information was not denied me by the Galactics. I simply could not understand the terms they used. All I can say now, and all I could say then, is that Galactican is some 3.5 kiloparsecs from Sol in the general direction Sagittarius. You don't know any more about that now than you did then, Jackson interrupted, suddenly and quickly. That's what I said, McLeod snapped, and that's what I mean. Let me finish. I was handsomely paid for my work in galactic money. They use the English word credit, but I'm not sure the English word has exactly the same meaning as the galactic term. At any rate, my wages, if such I may call them, were confiscated by the Earth government. I was given the equivalent in American dollars after 80% income tax had been deducted. I ended up with just about what I would have made if I had stayed home and drawn my salary from Columbia University and the American Museum of Natural History. Please, Mr. Jackson, I only have a little more to say. I decided to write a book in order to make the trip pay off. Interstellar Arc was a popularized account of the trip that may be quite a nice piece of change because every literate and half-literate person on Earth is curious about the galactics. The book tells everything I know about the trip and the people. It is a matter of public record. Since that is so, I refuse to answer a lot of darn full questions, by which I mean that I refuse to answer any more questions that you already know the answers to. I'm not being stubborn, I'm just sick and tired of the whole thing. Actually, the notoriety that had resulted from the trip and the book had not pleased McLeod particularly. He had never had any strong desire for fame, but if it had come as a result of his work in zoology and the related sciences, he would have accepted the burden. If The Ecology of Martian Polar Regions had attracted 100th of the publicity and sold 100th of the number of copies that Interstellar Arc had sold, he would have been gratified indeed. But the way things stood, he found the whole affair irksome. Jackson looked at his notebook as if he expected to see answers written there instead of questions. He looked back up at McLeod. All right then, Professor, what about this afternoon's conference? That isn't a matter of public record. And technically, it isn't any of your business either, McLeod said tiredly. But since you have the whole conversation down on tape, I don't see why you bother asking me. I'm well aware that you can pick up conversations in my apartment." Jackson pursed his lips and glanced at another of the agents, who raised his eyebrows slightly. McLeod got it, in spite of the fact that they didn't intend him to. His place was bugged, all right, but somehow the Galactic could manage to nullify their instruments. No wonder they were in such a tizzy. McLeod smiled, pleased with himself and with the world for the first time that afternoon. He decided, however, that he'd better volunteer the information before they threatened him with the Planetary Security Act. That threat would make him angry, he knew, and he might say something that would get him in real trouble. It was all right to badger Jackson up to a certain point, but it would be foolish to go beyond that. However, he went on with hardly a break. "Since, as you say, it is not a matter of public record, I'm perfectly willing to answer any questions you care to ask." "Just give us a general rundown of the conversation," Jackson said. "If I have any questions, I'll ask them at the proper time." McLeod did the best he could to give a clear picture of what the Galactic had wanted. There was really very little to it. The Galactic was a member of a race that McLeod had never seen before, a humanoid with red skin, fire engine, not a Mariandan, and rather a pleasant-looking face, in contrast to the rather crocodilian features of the Galactic resident. He had introduced himself by an unpronounceable name, and then had explained that since the name meant mild or merciful in one of the ancient tongues of his planet, it would be perfectly all right if McLeod called him Clement. Within minutes it had been Clem and Mac. McLeod could see that Jackson didn't quite believe that. Galactics of whatever race were aloof, polite, reserved, and sometimes irritatingly patronizing. Never buddy-buddy. McLeod couldn't help what Jackson might think. What was important was that it was true. What Clem wanted was very simple. Clem was, after a manner of speaking, a literary agent. Apparently, the galactic system of book publishing didn't quite work the way the terrestrial system did. Clem took his commission from the publisher instead of the author, but was considered a representative of the author, not the publisher. McLeod hadn't quite understood how that sort of thing would work out, but he let it pass. There were a lot of things he didn't understand about galactics. All Clem wanted was to act as McLeod's agent for the publication of Interstellar Arc. "And what did you tell him?" Jackson asked. "I told him I'd think it over." Jackson leaned forward. "How much money did he offer?" he asked eagerly. "Not much," McLeod said. "That's why I told him I'd think it over." He said that, considering the high cost of transportation, relaying, translation, and so on, he couldn't offer me more than 1,000th of the 1% royalties. Jackson blinked. "One what?" 1,000th of 1%. If the book sells 100,000 copies as a credit copy, they will send me a nice, juicy check for one lousy credit. Jackson scowled. "They're cheating you." Clem said it was the standard rate for a first book. Jackson shook his head. "Just because we don't have interstellar ships and are confined to our own solar system, they treat us as though we were ignorant savages. They're cheating you high, wide, and handsome." "Maybe," said McLeod, "but if they really wanted to cheat me, they could just pirate the book. There wouldn't be a thing I could do about it." "Yeah, but to keep up their facade of high ethics, they toss us a sop, and we have to take whatever they hand out. You will take it, of course." It was more of an order than a question. "I told him I'd think it over," McLeod said. Jackson stood up. "Professor McLeod, the human race needs every galactic credit it can lay its hands on. It's your duty to accept the offer, no matter how lousy it is. We have no choice in the matter. And a galactic credit is worth $10 American, £4 UK, or 40 rubles Soviet. If you sell 100,000 copies of your book, you can get yourself a meal in a fairly good restaurant, and Earth will have one more galactic credit stashed away. If you don't sell that many, you aren't out anything." "I suppose not," McLeod said slowly. He knew that the government could force him to take the offer. Under the Planetary Security Act, the government had broad powers, very broad. "Well, that isn't my business right now," Jackson said. "I just wanted to find out what this was all about." "You'll hear from us, Professor McLeod." "I don't doubt it," said McLeod. The 6 men filed out the door. Alone, McLeod stared at the wall and thought. Earth needed every galactic credit it could get, that was certain. The trouble came in getting them. The Earth had absolutely nothing that the galactics wanted. Well, not absolutely maybe, but so near as made no difference. Certainly there was no basis for trade. As far as the galactics were concerned, the Earth was a little backwater planet that was of no importance. Nothing manufactured on the planet was of any use to galactics. Nothing grown on Earth was of any commercial importance. They had sampled the animals and plants for scientific purposes, but there was no real commercial value in them. The government had added a few credits to its meager collection when the animals had been taken, but the amount was small. McLeod thought about the natives of New Guinea and decided that on the galactic scale, Earth was about in the same position. Except that there had at least been gold in New Guinea. The galactics didn't have any interest in Earth's minerals. The elements were much more easily available in the asteroid belts that nearly every planetary system seemed to have. The galactics were by no means interested in bringing civilization to the barbarians of Earth either. They had no missionaries to bring new religion, no do-gooders to elevate the cultural level of the natives. They had no free handouts for anyone. If Earthmen wanted anything from them, the terms were cash on the barrelhead. Earth's credit rating in the galactic equivalent of Dun & Bradstreet was CCC 0. A galactic Earth ship had, so to speak, stumbled over Earth 15 years before. Like the English explorers of the 18th and 19th centuries, the galactics seemed to feel that it was necessary to install one of their own people on a newfound planet, but they were not in the least interested in colonization, nor in taking over Earth's government. The galactic resident was not in any case a royal governor, and could hardly even be called an ambassador. He and his staff, a small one, kept more for company than for any necessary work, lived quietly by themselves in a house they built in Hawaii. Nobody knew what they did, and it didn't seem wise to ask. The first galactic resident had been shot and killed by some religious nut. Less than 24 hours later, the Galactic Space Navy, if that was the proper term, had come to claim the body. They came in a spaceship that was easily visible to the naked eye long before it hit the atmosphere, a sphere 3 kilometers in diameter. The missiles with the thermonuclear warheads that were sent up to intercept the ship were detonated long before they touched the ship, and neither Galactics nor Earthmen ever mentioned them again. It had been the most frightening display of power ever seen on Earth, and the Galactics hadn't even threatened anyone. They just came to get a body. Needless to say, there was little danger that they would ever have to repeat the performance. The national governments of Earth had organized themselves hurriedly into the Terrestrial Union. Shaky at first, it had gained stability and power over the years. The first thing the Union government had wanted to do was to send an ambassador to the galactic government. The galactic resident had politely explained that their concept of government was different from ours, that ambassadors had no place in that concept, and anyway, there was no capital to send one to. However, if Earth wanted to send an observer of some kind, Earth did. Fine. A statement of passenger fares was forthcoming, naturally. There was no regular passenger ship stopping at Earth, and there would not be in the foreseeable future, but doubtless arrangements could be made to charter a vessel. It would be expensive, but if a New Guinea savage wants to take a passage aboard a Qantas airliner, what is the fare in cowrie shells? As far as McLeod knew, his book was the first thing ever produced on Earth that the Galactics were even remotely interested in. He had a higher opinion of the ethics of the Galactics than Jackson did, but 0.001% seemed like pretty small royalties, and he couldn't for the life of him see why this book would interest a galactic. Clem had explained that it gave galactics a chance to see what they looked like through the eyes of an Earthman, but that seemed rather weak to MacLeod. Nevertheless, he knew he would take Clem's offer. 8 months later, a shipload of galactic tourists arrived. For a while, it looked as though Earth's credit problem might be solved. Tourism has always been a fine method for getting money from other countries, especially if one's own country is properly picturesque. Tourists always had money, didn't they? And they spent it freely, didn't they? No, not in this case. Earth had nothing to sell to the tourists. Ever hear of baylets? The Malaysians of the South Pacific consider it a very fine delicacy. You take a fertilized duck egg and you bury it in the warm earth. 6 months later, when it's nice and overripe, you take it up again, knock off the top of the shell the way you would a soft-boiled egg, and eat it. Then you pick the pin feathers out of your teeth. Baylets. Now you know how the greatest delicacies of Earth restaurants affected the galactics. Earth was just a little too picturesque. The tourists enjoyed the sights, but they ate aboard their ship, which was evidently somewhat like a Caribbean cruise ship. And they bought nothing, they just looked and laughed. And of course they all wanted to meet Professor John Hamish MacLeod. When the news leaked out and was thoroughly understood by Earth's population, there was an immediate reaction. Editorial in Pravda. The stupid book written by the American J.H. MacLeod has made Earth a laughingstock throughout the galaxy. His inability to comprehend the finer nuances of galactic socialism has made all Earthmen look foolish. It is too bad that a competent Russian zoologist was not chosen for the trip that MacLeod made. A man properly trained in the understanding of the historical forces of dialectic materialism would have realized that any galactic society must of necessity be a communist state, and would have interpreted it as such. The petty bourgeois mind of MacLeod has made it impossible for any Earthman to hold up his head in the free socialist society of the galaxy, until this matter is corrected. News from Manchester Guardian. Professor James H. MacLeod, the American zoologist whose book has apparently aroused a great deal of hilarity in galactic circles, admitted today that both Columbia University and the American Museum of Natural History have accepted his resignation. The recent statement by a university spokesman that Professor MacLeod had besmirched the honor of Earthmen everywhere was considered at least partially responsible for the resignations. See editorial. Editorial Manchester Guardian. It is a truism that an accepted wit has only to say, "Pass the butter," and everyone will laugh. Professor MacLeod, however, far from being an accepted wit, seems rather to be in the position of a medieval court fool who is laughed at rather than with. As a consequence, all Earthmen have been branded as fools. Statement made by the American senator from Alabama. He has made us all look like jackasses in the eyes of the galactics, and at this precarious time in human history, it is my considered opinion that such actions are treasonous to the human race and to Earth, and should be treated and considered as such. Book review, literary checklist, Elvar 3, Borneus Cluster. Interstellar Arc, an Earthman's view of the galaxy, translated from the original tongue by Bonus Delph circa 5.00. This inexpensive little book is one of the most highly entertainingly funny publications in current print. The author, one John MacLeod, is a member of a Type 3-7b race inhabiting a planet in the outer fringes. As an example of the unwitting humor of the book, we have only to quote the following. I was shown to my quarters shortly before takeoff. Captain Benarley had assigned me a spacious cabin which was almost luxurious in its furnishings. The bed was one of the most comfortable I have ever slept in. Or the following. I found the members of the crew to be friendly and cooperative, especially Nern Kronzel, the ship's physician. It It is our prediction that this little gem will be enjoyed for a long time to come, and will be a real moneymaker for his publishers. They haven't hanged me yet, McLeod thought. He sat in his apartment alone and realized that it would take very little effort to get him hanged. How could one book have aroused such wrath? Even as he thought it, McLeod knew the answer to that question. It wasn't the book. No one who had read it in 2.5 years before had said anything against it. No, it wasn't the book. It was the galactic reaction to the book. Already feeling inferior because of the standoffish attitude of the beings from the stars, the Homeric laughter of those same beings had been too much. It would have been bad enough if that laughter had been generated by one of the galactics. To have it generated by an Earthman made it that much worse. Against an Earthman, their rage was far from impotent. Nobody understood why the book was funny, of course. The joke was over their heads, and that made human beings even angrier. He remembered a quotation from a book he had read once. A member of some tribal taboo culture, African or South Pacific, he forgot which, had been treated at a missionary hospital for something or other and had described his experience. The white witch doctor protects himself by wearing a little round mirror on his head which reflects back the evil spirits. Could that savage have possibly understood what was humorous about that remark? No, not even if you explained to him why the doctor used the mirror that way. Now what? Thought McLeod. He was out of a job and his bank account was running low. His credit rating had dropped to 0. McLeod heard a key turn in the lock. The door swung open and Jackson entered with a squad of UBI men. "Hey," said McLeod, jumping to his feet. "What do you think this is?" "Shut up, McLeod," Jackson growled. "Get your coat. You're wanted at headquarters." McLeod started to say something, then thought better of it. There was nothing he could say. Nobody would care if the UBI manhandled him. Nobody would protest that his rights were being ignored. If McLeod got his teeth knocked in, Jackson would probably be voted a medal. McLeod didn't say another word. He followed orders. He got his coat and was taken down to the big building on the East River, which had begun its career as the United Nations building. He was bundled up to an office and shoved into a chair. Somebody shoved a paper at him. "Sign this." "What is it?" McLeod asked, finding his voice. "A receipt. For $2,000. Sign it." McLeod looked the paper over, then looked up at the burly man who had shoved it at him. 50,000 galactic credits. What's this for? "The royalty check for your unprintably qualified book has come in, funny man. The government is taking 98% for income taxes. Sign." McLeod pushed the paper back across the desk. "No, I won't. You can confiscate my money. I can't stop that, I guess. But I won't give it legal sanction by signing anything. I don't even see the $2,000 this is supposed to be a receipt for." Jackson, who was standing behind McLeod, grabbed his arm and twisted. "Sign." His voice was a snarl in McLeod's ear. Eventually, of course, he signed. "No beer, Mac?" asked the bartender with a friendly smile. "Yeah, Leo, thanks." McLeod pushed his quarter across the bar with one hand and scratched negligently at his beard with the fingers of the other. Nobody questioned him in this neighborhood. The beard, which had taken 2 months to grow, disguised his face, and he had given his name as McCaffrey, allowing his landlord and others who heard it to make the natural assumption that he was of Irish descent. He was waiting. He had been forced to move from his apartment. Nobody wanted that dirty so-and-so, Professor McLeod, around. Besides, his money was running short. He had never seen the 2,000. "You'll get that when the Galactic Bank cashes your royalty check," he had been told. He was waiting. Not hiding. No, that was impossible. The UBI could find him easily when they wanted him. There was no place he could have hidden from them for very long. A man needs friends to stay hidden from an efficient police organization for very long, and John Hamish McLeod had no friends. Jack McCaffrey had, since he was a pleasant kind of fellow who made friends easily when he wanted them. But he had no illusions about his new friends. Let them once suspect, however faintly, that good old Jack McCaffrey was really the Professor McCloud, and the game would be up. The UBI would find him again all right whenever it wanted him. And McCloud hoped it would be soon because he was down to his last $100. So he waited and thought about 50,000 galactic credits. The mathematics was simple, but it conveyed an awful lot of information. To make 50,000 credits from 1,000th of 1% royalties on a book selling at 5 credits the copy, one must needs sell 1 billion copies. Nothing to it. 5 times minus 10 to the minus 5th power equals 5.10 to the 4th power. Ergo, x equals 10 to the 9th power. McCloud drew the equation on the bar with the tip of a wet forefinger, then rubbed them out quickly. 1 billion copies in the first year. He should have seen it. He should have understood. How many planets were there in the galaxy? How many people on each planet? Communication, even at ultralight velocities, would be necessarily slow. The galaxy was just too big to be compassed by the human mind, or even by the mind of a galactic, McCloud suspected. How do you publish a book for galactic, for galaxy-wide consumption? How long does it take to saturate the market on each planet? How long does it take to spread the book from planet to planet? How many people were there on each planet who would buy a good book, or at least an entertaining one? McCloud didn't know, but he suspected that the number was huge. McCloud was a zoologist, not an astronomer, but he had read enough on astronomy to know that the estimated number of Earth-type planets alone, according to the latest theory, ran into the tens of millions or hundreds of millions. A man sat down on the stool next to McCloud and said something loud enough and foul enough to break the zoologist's train of thought. "Give me a shot, Leo," he added in an angry voice. "Sure, Pete," the bartender said. "What's the trouble?" "Taurus," Pete said with a snarl. "Laughing at us all the time, like we was monkeys in a zoo. Bunch 'em come in today." He downed his whiskey with a practiced flip of the wrist and slammed it down on the bar. Leo refilled it immediately. "I shouldn't gripe, I guess. Gotta have a credit off him." He slapped down a $5 bill as though it had somehow been contaminated. The bar became oddly quiet. Everyone had heard another shipload of galactics had landed and were at the moment enjoying the size of New York. A few of them knew that Pete was the bell captain in one of the big midtown hotels. McCloud listened while Pete expounded on the shame he had to undergo to earn half a credit, a lousy $5. McCloud did some estimating. Tourist, the word had acquired an even more pejorative sense than it had before, and now applied only to galactics, bought nothing, but they tipped for services, unless the services weren't wanted or needed. Pete had given them information that they hadn't had before, where to find a particular place. The group of 15 galactics had given out 5 or 6 credits in such tips, say half a credit apiece. There were perhaps 100 galactics in this shipload. That meant 50 credits. They didn't need anyone to carry their bags. They didn't need anyone to register them in hotels. They didn't need personal service of that kind. All they wanted to do was look, but they wouldn't pay for looking. They had no interest in Broadway plays or the acts in the nightclubs, at least not enough to induce them to pay to see them. This particular group had wanted to see a hotel. They had wandered through it, looking at everything and laughing to fit to kill at the carpets on the floor and the electric lighting and such. But when the management had hinted that payment for such services as letting them look should be forthcoming, they had handed half a credit to someone and walked out. Then they had gone to the corner of 51st and Madison and looked for nothing. 50 credits for a shipload. 3 shiploads per year. Hell, give them the benefit of the doubt and say 10 shiploads a year. In 100 years, they'd add another 50,000 to Earth's resources. McLeod grinned and waited. They came for him eventually, as McLeod had always known they would. But they came long before he had expected. He had given them 6 months, at the least. They came for him at the end of the 3rd month. It was Jackson, of course. It would have to be Jackson. He walked into the cheap little room McLeod had rented, followed by a squad of men. He tossed a peculiar envelope on the bed next to McLeod. "A letter came for you, humorist. Open it." McLeod sat on the edge of the bed and read the letter. The envelope had already been opened, which surprised him none. It looked very much like an ordinary business letter, except that whatever they used for paper was wider and tougher than the paper he used. He was reminded of the time he had seen a reproduction of a 13th century manuscript alongside the original. The copy had been set up in a specially designed type and printed on fine paper. The original had been handwritten on vellum. McLeod had the feeling that if he used a microscope on this letter, the lines and edges would be just as precise and clear as they appeared to the naked eye, instead of the fuzziness that ordinary print would show. The way you could tell a synthetic ruby from a natural ruby is to look for flaws. The synthetic doesn't have any. This letter was the galactic imitation of a Terran business letter. It said, "Dear Mac, I am happy to report that your book, Interstellar Arc, is a smash hit. It looks as though it is on its way to becoming a bestseller. As you already know by your royalty statement, over 1 billion copies were sold the first year. That indicates even better sales over the years to come as the reputation of the book spreads. Naturally, our advertising campaign will remain behind it all the way. Congratulations. Speaking of royalty checks, there seems to be some sort of irregularity about yours. I am sorry, but according to regulations, the check must be validated in the presence of your galactic resident before it can be cashed. Your signature across the back of it doesn't mean anything to our bankers. Just go to your galactic resident and he'll be happy to take care of the matter for you. That's what he's there for. The next check should come through very shortly. All the best, Clem." Better and better, McLeod thought. He hadn't expected to be able to do anything until his next royalty check arrived. But he looked up at Jackson. "All right, what's next?" "Come with us. We're flying to Hawaii. Get your hat and coat." McLeod obeyed silently. At the moment, there was nothing else he could do. As a matter of fact, there was nothing he wanted to do more. It was no trouble at all for Professor McLeod to get an audience with the galactic resident. But when he was escorted in by Jackson and his squad, the whole group was halted inside the front door. The resident, a tall, lean being with a leathery gray face that somehow managed to look crocodilian in spite of the fact that his head was definitely humanoid in shape, peered at them from beneath pronounced supraorbital ridges. "Is this man under arrest?" he asked in a gravelly baritone. No," said Jackson. "No, he's merely in protective custody. He has not been convicted of any crime." "No, sir," Jackson said. His voice sounded as though it were unsure of himself. "That is well," said the resident. "A convicted criminal cannot, of course, use the credits of society until he has become rehabilitated." He paused. "But why protective custody?" "There are those," said Jackson, choosing his words with care, "who feel that Professor McLeod has brought disgrace upon the human race, or the terrestrial race. There is reason to believe that his life may be in danger." McLeod smiled wryly. What Jackson said was true, but it was carefully calculated to mislead. "I see," said the resident. "It would appear to me that it would be simpler to inform the people that he has done no such thing. That indeed, his work has conferred immense benefits upon your race. But that is your own affair. At any rate, he is in no danger here." He didn't need to say anything else. Jackson knew the hint was in order and that he wouldn't get any farther with his squad. McLeod spoke up. "Subject to your permission, sir, I would like to have Mr. Jackson with me." The galactic resident smiled. course, Professor. Come in, both of you." He turned and led the way through the inner door. Nobody bothered to search either of them, not even though they must know that Jackson was carrying a gun. McLeod was fairly certain that the gun would be useless to Jackson if he tried to assert his authority with it. If Clem had been able to render the UBI's eavesdropping apparatus inoperable, it was highly probable that the Galactic Resident would have some means of taking care of weapons. "There are only a few formalities to go through," the resident said pleasantly, indicating chairs with a gesture. The room he had led them to didn't look much different from that which would be expected in any tastefully furnished apartment in New York or Honolulu. McLeod and Jackson sat down in a couple of comfortable easy chairs while the resident went around a large desk and sat down in a swivel chair behind it. He smiled a little and looked at McLeod. "Ah, yes, very good." It was as though he had received information of some kind on an unknown subject through an unknown channel, McLeod thought. Evidently that was true, for his next words were, "You are not under the influence of drugs or hypnotic compulsion, I see." "Excellent, Professor. Is it your desire that this check be converted to cash?" He made a small gesture. "You have only to express it, you see. It would be difficult to explain it to you, but rest assured that such an expression of will, while you are seated in that chair, is impressed upon the structure of the check itself and is the equivalent of a signature. Except, of course, that it is unforgeable." "May I ask a few questions first?" McLeod said. "Certainly, Professor. I am here to answer your questions." "The money, is it free and clear, or are there galactic taxes to pay?" If the Galactic Residents had had eyebrows, it is likely that they would have lifted in surprise. "My dear Professor, aside from the fact that we run our government in an entirely different manner, we would consider it quite immoral to take what a man earns without giving services of an exact kind. I will charge you 5 credits for this validation, since I am rendering a service. The bank will take a full 0.1% in this case because of the inconvenience of shipping cash over that long distance. The rest is yours to do with as you see fit." 55 credits out of 55,000, McLeod thought. Not bad at all. Aloud he asked, "Could I, for instance, open a bank account or buy a ticket on a starship?" "Why not? As I said, it's your money. You have earned it honestly. You may spend it honestly." Jackson was staring at McLeod, but he said nothing. "Tell me, sir," McLeod said, "how does the success of my book compare with the successes of most books in the galaxy?" "Quite favorably, I understand," said the resident. "The usual income from a successful book is about 5,000 credits a year. Some run even less than that. I'm not too familiar with the publishing business, you understand, but that is my impression. You are, by galactic standards, a very wealthy man, Professor. 50,000 a year is by no means a median income." 50,000 a year? "Yes, about that. I understand that in the publishing business one can depend on a life income that does not vary much from the initial period. If a book is successful in one area of the galaxy, it will be equally successful in others." "How long does it take to saturate the market?" McLeod asked with a touch of awe. "Saturate the... Oh, I see. Yes, well, let's see. Most publishing houses can't handle the advertising and marketing on more than 1,000 planets at once. The job becomes too unwieldy. That would indicate that you sold an average of 1 million copies per planet, which is unusual but not miraculous. That is why you can depend on future sales, you see. Over 1,000 planets, the differences in planetary tastes averages out. Now, if your publishers continue to expand the publication at the rate of 1,000 planets a year, your book should easily last for another century. They can't really expand that rapidly, of course, since the sales on the planets they have already covered will continue with diminishing success over the next several years. Actually, your publishers will continue to put 1 billion books a year on the market and expand to new planets at a rate that will balance the loss of sales on the planets where it has already run its course. Yes, Professor, you will have good income for life." what about my heirs? Heirs? The galactic resident blinked. I'm afraid I don't quite follow you. My relatives, anyone who will inherit my property after my death. The resident still looked puzzled. What about them? How long can they go on collecting? When does the copyright run out? The galactic resident's puzzlement vanished. Oh, my dear professor, surely you see that it is impossible to inherit money one hasn't earned. The income stops with your death. Your children or your wife have done nothing to earn the money. Why should it continue to be paid out after the earner has died? If you wish to make provisions for such persons during your lifetime, that is your business, but the provisions must be made out of money you have already earned. Who does get the income then? McLeod asked. The galactic resident looked thoughtful. Well, the best I can explain to you without going into arduous detail is to say that our government gets it. Government is not really the proper word in this context, since we have no government as you think of it. Let us merely say that such monies pass into a common exchequer from which public servants like myself are paid. McLeod had a vision of a British Crown officer trying to explain to a New Guinea tribesman what he meant when he said that taxes go to the Crown. The tribesman would probably wonder why the chief of the English tribe kept cowrie shells under his hat. I see. And if I'm imprisoned for crime, he asked. The payments are suspended until the rehabilitation is complete. That is, until you are legally released. Is there anything else that can stop the payments? Not unless the publishing company fails, which is highly unlikely. Of course, a man under hypnotic compulsion or drugs is not considered legally responsible, so he cannot transact any legal business while he is in that state, but the checks are merely held for him until that impediment is removed. I see, McLeod nodded. He knew perfectly well that he no more understood the entire workings of the galactic civilization than that New Guinea tribesman understood the civilization of Great Britain, but he also knew that he understood more of it than Jackson, for instance, did. McLeod had been able to foresee a little of what the resident had said. Would you do me the service, sir, McLeod said, of opening a bank account for me in some local bank? Yes, of course. As resident, I am empowered to transact business for you at your request. My fees are quite reasonable. All checks will have to go through me, of course. But, I think in this case, a 0.20% would be appropriate. You'll be handling very large amounts. If that is your wish, I shall so arrange it. Hey, Jackson found his tongue. The Earth Union government has a claim on that. McLeod owes 49,000 galactic credits in income taxes. If the galactic resident was shocked at the intimation that the galactic government would take earned money from a man, the announcement that Earth's government did so was no surprise to him at all. If that is so, I am certain that Professor McLeod will behave as a law-abiding citizen. He can authorize a check for that amount, and it will be honored by his bank. We have no desire to interfere with local customs. I am certain that I can come to an equitable arrangement with the Earth authorities, said McLeod, rising from his chair. Is there anything I have to sign, or... No, you have expressed your will. Thank you, Professor McLeod. It is a pleasure to do business with you. Thank you. The pleasure is mutual. Come on, Jackson. We don't need to bother the resident anymore just now. But, come on, I said. I want a few words with you, McLeod insisted. Jackson sensed that there would be no point in arguing any further with the resident, but he followed McLeod out into the bright Hawaiian sunshine with a dull glow of anger burning his cheeks. Accompanied by the squad, they climbed into the car and left. As soon as they were well away from the residence, Jackson grabbed McLeod by the lapel of his jacket. All right, humorist, what was the idea of that? Are you trying to make things hard for yourself? No, but you are, McLeod said in a cold voice. Get your hands off me. I may get you fired anyway, just because you're a louse. But if you keep acting like this, I'll see that they toss you into solitary and toss the key away. What are you talking about? But he released his hold. Just think about it, Jackson. The government can't get its hands on that money unless I permit it. As I said, we'll arrive at an equitable arrangement, and that will be a damn sight less than 98% of my earnings, believe me. If you refuse to pay, he stopped suddenly, throw me in jail. McLeod shook his head. You can't get money while I'm in jail. We'll wait, said Jackson firmly. After a little while in a cell, you'll listen to reason and we'll sign those checks. You don't think very well, do you, Jackson? To sign a check, I have to go to the galactic resident. As soon as you take me to him, I authorize a check to buy me a ticket for some nice planet where there are no income taxes. Jackson opened his mouth and shut it again, frowning. Think about it, Jackson, McLeod continued. Nobody can get that money from me without my consent. Now it so happens that I want to help Earth. I have a certain perverse fondness for the human race, even though it is inconceivably backward by galactic standards. We have about as much chance of ever becoming of any importance on a galactic scale as the Australian Aborigine has of becoming important in world politics, but a few thousand years of evolution may bring out a few individuals who have the ability to do something. I'm not sure, but I'm damned if I'll let the boneheads run all over me while they take my money. I happen to be, at the moment, and through sheer luck, Earth's only natural resources as far as the galaxy is concerned. Sure, you can put me in jail, you can kill me if you want, but that won't give you the money. I am the goose that lays the golden eggs, but I'm not such a goose that I'm going to let you boot me in the tail while you steal the gold. Earth has no other source of income, none. Tourists are few and far between, and they spend almost nothing. As long as I'm alive, and in good health and out of prison, Earth will have a nice steady income of 50,000 galactic credits a year. Earth, I said, not the government, except indirectly. I intend to see that my money isn't confiscated. He had a few other plans too, but he saw no necessity of mentioning them to Jackson. If I don't like the way the government behaves, I'll simply shut off the source of supply. Understand, Jackson? Said Jackson. He understood. He didn't like it, and he didn't know what to do about it. One of the first things we're going to do is start a little information flowing, McLeod said. I don't care to live on a planet where everybody hates my guts, so as the resident suggested, we're going to have to start a propaganda campaign to counteract the one that denounced me. For that, I'll want to talk to someone a little higher in the government. You'd better take me to the head of the UBI. He'll know who I should speak to for that purpose. Jackson still looked dazed, but it had evidently penetrated that McLeod had the upper hand. What did you say, sir? He asked, partially coming out of his daze. McLeod sighed. Take me to your leader, he said patiently. End of section 13. Thank you for listening to this whisper reading from Southern Cadence. Remember to like and subscribe to be notified for more whispering stories. Have a peaceful rest.